Dragon Age Veilguard. Wait, Dragon Age the Veilguard. Ugh. I'm not saying the. Tastes terrible. Dragon Age Veilguard is another Dragon Age game. It's the worst Dragon Age game. It's a miracle that it's so good. Deeper than it's made out to be, shallower than it should have been, the culmination of the series' slow abandonment of its RPG roots, and a fitting and satisfying resolution to a 10-year-old cliffhanger. It's hated for reasons largely undeserving, and understandably disappointing for numerous moments of flagrant missed potential. And we're going to talk about it. Veilguard is another Dragon Age game. It's okay. If I had to sum up my thoughts as briefly as possible, I'd say it is roughly on par with Mass Effect 3 in terms of quality, though not for the same reasons. Mass Effect 3 keeps shifting between excellence and awfulness in terms of narrative moments, while Veilguard's story doesn't have as many high points, but also little I would consider truly bad. It's more just blandly fine throughout. It does have a great ending, at least. It is clearly modeled after Mass Effect 2's team-building structure, and its main plot is much better than that game's, but its companion stories are clearly worse. Veilguard is approximately as good as Mass Effect 3. A real return to form. Some form, anyway. So we're going to talk about almost everything. The characters, the story, the changes to gameplay, the party dynamics, the use of the Codex, the iteration on Mass Effect 2's Impossible mission, and Manfred. If White Light can wring multiple hours of real analysis from Ubisoft games, I can find stuff to talk about here. Spoilers will be unrelenting for Dragon Age Origins, 2, Inquisition, Veilguard, Mass Effect 2 and 3, and maybe, very briefly, Baldur's Gate 3. If you love this game, I hope you'll enjoy hearing critiques that are based in genuine engagement with the text instead of rage bait.
Pronouns!
We don't do that here.
If you hate this game, I hope I can help you recognize what it's doing, even if it's still not for you. If you hate this game but you never actually played it, thanks for watching, I guess. Here's a Marcus Aurelius quote you should probably sit with for a while. I played the game twice, the first time as a human Shadow Dragon mage who I nicknamed the Hair Metal Wizard, who generally acted like an irreverent rebel in his demeanor, which is to say I picked the wisecracking Whedon-esque dialogue options a lot. I also did my best to recreate my Inquisitor from my first playthrough of Inquisition 10 years ago. Overall, the character creator is fantastic, and I completely understand BioWare releasing the creator on its own as a standalone toy like Saints Row 3 and 4 did, or Spore. You can make some truly gorgeous and truly disastrous-looking Rooks. However, the differences that exist between this creator and Inquisition's, such as different hairstyles and different scars to choose from, means that it's disappointingly difficult to faithfully recreate your Inquisitor if you want to. This is a problem Inquisition had as well, as I found that the wild, raggedy beard and hair and face tattoos I gave my Hawk in Dragon Age 2 did not exist when remaking him in Inquisition. So it's disappointing that this exact same problem was repeated from the last game. Anyway, my second playthrough is the one where I recorded the footage you'll be seeing, and that gave me the opportunity to revisit key moments with the full picture and also see different outcomes of key choices. In the interest of quickly getting through it to record and analyze the narrative, this run was on easy story mode for babies, so if you see footage of combat going by weirdly fast, that's why. My main playthrough was on normal. I decided this second Rook would be an elven crow who looks like he walked out of a Square Enix game, and that he would test the common criticism that player dialogue is forced to be too nice by trying to be as rude a dude as possible. I also decided that this playthrough's Inquisitor would be an elf who romanced Solas, but was so horrified by the reveal of his true self that she vowed to stop him by any means necessary, because I figured this would be extra dramatic. So with that established, let's begin our adventure. Veilguard begins in medias res in order to launch us right into the action. No time for boring introductions or having some long exposition about what's going on beyond a short narration from Varric. We don't even get to see Rook meet Varric for the first time, we're just in the middle of a job, interrogating people at a bar about where Neve Gallus is, and we, as players, have to catch up. It's kinda like if Origins started at Ostagar with the Warden already knowing Duncan. Theoretically, veteran Dragon Age players are already knowledgeable with how things work and don't need to sit through exposition, while newcomers wouldn't want to get bogged down in jargon without any sign of action. And besides, most of the other Dragon Ages start similarly. Origins is the only one with slow burn starts to ease players into their respective origins. 2 begins in the middle of the Hawk family's fight-filled flight from the Darkspawn, while Inquisition begins with the Conclave exploding and the soon-to-be Inquisitor dramatically interrogated by Cassandra. However, it doesn't work the same here for a few reasons. In Veilguard, Rook has already met both Varric and Harding, and there is a disconnect between a veteran player's familiarity with them and the familiarity we can assume Rook has. We do already know these dwarves, so I'm sure the intention was to relate us to Rook by saying Rook already knows them too, but the context the player knows them from is different from the context Rook has. This attempt at harmony between player and player character is instead a mismatch. It requires more context than the immediately understandable familiar relationships between the Hawks, and the not yet Inquisitor meets everyone in the Inquisition intro at the same time we do. With Rook, it feels like we're playing catch-up with our own character, and while that can certainly work in some cases, this isn't some deliberate disorientation like the start of 1000 Times Resist. It's meant to be a mass appeal action opening. It may work better if you're a total novice to the series and you can simply assume that these people have worked together before without having expectations for them. But even for such a player, the Veilguard intro is so focused on the specific action of Solas' ritual that the dialogue between the characters is all situation-first, objective-oriented, and mostly devoid of establishing characterization. Varric, and to a lesser extent Harding, are giving more exposition about Solas to catch up forgetful or unfamiliar players, and also the unfamiliar Rook, while also being one of several voices saying, "Oh no, this is bad, we have to stop Solas, this sure is bad."
Looks like the Venatori put up a barrier and blocked the way.
Quite a few of them, aren't there?
Nothing compared to how many will get if Solas finishes his ritual trap. Let's move!
One of the few elements of the writing I would call genuinely bad in this game is the collection of dialogue barks in the middle of combat or during set-piece moments like this. They're empty lines that do nothing but fill space, just restating what we already know to remind us over and over what the stakes of a given mission are, and contributing nothing to the situation or their character arcs. And sometimes shouting "enemy at range" when the enemy is at range, which is almost never helpful. And unfortunately, this is most of the dialogue we're experiencing in this intro. We do at least get to experience Rook's first time meeting Neve. As the hair metal wizard, this was love at first sight. But as Anime Crow, she's just another ally. Veilguard likes to introduce its companions with dramatic moments of them dispatching enemies. Sometimes it works because it's done in a way that relates to their actual characters, like with Bellara. Emmrich and Davrin are actually introduced in different ways. But here, with Harding and Neve, it's little more than competently killing enemies. It's especially disappointing for Neve because her profession is detective. And while Rook is meeting her because she used her detective skills to find Solas' hideout, the context of this being an action intro while demons are raining on the city after Neve has already found Solas means we don't see her deduction skills at work yet. Instead, this feels less like we're meeting a detective and more like we're meeting an advanced military scout. You know, like Harding is. So to recap, this game begins with a disorienting attempt at in medias res that is all about spectacle while pushing off a lot of the actual characterization until later, and filling where it would have been with mostly empty dialogue that is pure function for the situation. The good news is the writing gets better from here. The bad news is that first impressions matter and this game puts its worst foot forward. But then the party catches up to Solas and all of a sudden the writing comes alive. Through both dialogue and vocal performance, the conversation between Solas and Varric carries the weight of their past journey together. Interestingly, even though I had chosen this time that the Inquisitor vowed to stop Solas no matter the cost, Varric is his own person and he still wanted to try talking. He and Solas were friends once, and both still clearly hold affection for each other even if Solas is trying to bury it. After about 20 minutes of an intro filled with pure function dialogue, it's almost startling when Solas' lines are more. They are layered. Whatever other narrative shortcomings there may be in this game, Solas remains as excellent a character as he was in Inquisition. Let's rewind a few minutes. When the crew finds Solas' hideout in Tevinter before they go through the Alluvion to Arlathan, they find remnants of slave chains. What was Solas doing in Minrathous at all if his ritual was in Arlathan? He was freeing slaves. Some random slave-freeing adventure was the last thing he does before beginning his ritual to end the world. Yes, I know the ritual at the moment Rook interrupts is about him changing the Evanuris' prison, but when he's accused of planning to immediately go from there to tearing down the rest of the Veil, he never denies that. So why would he do this, go out of his way to free slaves before ending the world? Which was probably what tipped off Neve to his location and allowed Varric's crew to stop him in the first place. I think he wanted to assuage his guilt for what he was about to do with one more good deed, like how he tipped the Inquisition off about the Dragon's Breath plot in Trespasser because he didn't want the whole world oppressed under the Qun when he ended it. Solas is good at self-pity even as he insists on going through with things he knows will cause harm. And he also misses the elven world of old back when he was a freedom fighter who was obviously on the good side. He wants to remind himself of the hero he used to be before he causes untold suffering. It's also noticeable that rather than wearing his wolf-themed villain outfit from Trespasser, Solas is wearing the same clothes he does in Veilguard's flashbacks to his rebellion. Sure, this may just be efficient model reuse, but it still aids in this interpretation. It's effective, subtle characterization, especially for a game that barely knows what subtlety is. The moment is undermined by the clunkiness of how Varric reminds the audience about Solas' past heroism, but it's still there. Alas, the Dreadwolf doesn't do one last good deed before ending the world because his ritual is interrupted. I want to quickly mention that the moment of choosing either Harding or Neve to go with you to interrupt the ritual actually means choosing which of them gets hurt. Interesting. Remember that. Rook's first dream conversation with Solas, trapped in his Fade prison, is electric, with even Solas' exposition of who Elgar'nan and Gillinan are being elevated by the haughty way he does it, talking them up as a way of driving home how much trouble Rook is in, which is, in turn, a way of venting his frustration and expressing a sense of superiority.
They said they were gods. Blighted, tyrannical, sadistic gods. It took all my power to imprison them millennia ago, but I am certain you will be fine.
The exposition is happening in tandem with characterization instead of at the expense of it like has been the case so far. It's not like an exceptional scene for the pantheon of all-time best moments of drama, but it is straightforwardly good, a breath of life that helps sustain through the rest of the rocky first act of this game. When Rook wakes up, they talk to Varric, and you see that either Neve or Harding got hurt because of your decision, and we start to get those little "here are the results of your choice" notifications. It's a slightly more detailed version of what those Telltale games do with their "this character will remember this" notification and its variations.
What the hell is that?
BioWare has never done it before, and didn't need to here. It's condescending for the most part, though on a few occasions it can be helpful to remind you about something that happened a while ago. Even then, there's usually other bits of dialogue that do that anyway. RPGs usually work fine without the Telltale pop-ups. Eventually I got to the point where I barely register them, and they don't bother me anymore. Kind of like the backer NPCs in Pillars of Eternity, who I got so used to ignoring, I completely forgot to mention them at all in my video on that game. Anyway, you get to briefly explore your new home base, the Lighthouse, a sanctuary and a stabilized pocket dimension of the Fade that Solas used as his base during his rebellion against the Evanurus all those years ago. You check in with Neve and Harding, and Rook decides to go back to the ritual site to see if anything there will help deal with the gods that just escaped into the world. After stepping back through the Alluvion and returning to Arlathan Forest, we immediately meet the Veil Jumpers. We tell them that their gods have escaped and are up to no good, we find our next companion, Bellara, and then travel with her for a bit to stabilize a magical relic, and along the way we have our first encounter with the Darkspawn. So, this entire mission features the game's continued problem with setting up its story, but in a different way. While the Minrathous job was mostly so fixated on the spectacle of the set piece it didn't give us much characterization to latch onto, this mission gives us abrupt introductions to two major concepts that are in-universe changes from what used to be the norm, but are not initially presented as such, which makes things that are not inconsistencies feel like inconsistencies. The Veil Jumpers are made up of mostly elves, and by mostly I mean Rook can be a member regardless of species, but otherwise they are the elf faction of this game. And as soon as the Evanurus are mentioned, the Jumpers already know that their gods are cruel and evil. How does that make sense, a veteran Dragon Age player might say? I thought Elgar'nan and Gillinan were considered among the good gods of elven mythology. Why do these elves already know they're evil? Well, this is 10 years after Inquisition, and Harding treats the Jumpers with familiarity, which means they're at least in contact with whatever the world state says remains of the Inquisition, who presumably filled them in on Solas. Additionally, with the weakening of the Veil thanks to the breach, who knows what the Veiljumpers could have discovered from Arlathan, as memories of the ancient elves have more chances to leak through from the Fade. As we see later with Hezenkos, the once monumental feat of physically entering the Fade seems to have become a lot more commonplace since the breach incident. And with Morrigan having found and allied with the Veiljumpers some time ago, they also have the knowledge of Mythal at their disposal, even if they don't know it. The Veiljumpers have had a decade to take advantage of all these connections and learn the truth about their gods before Solas's botched ritual freed 2 of them. And we can find some notes written by the Jumpers grappling with the impact of this world-reversing truth, as well as party banter with and between Bellara and Davrin. So the Veiljumpers having this knowledge makes perfect sense. That doesn't make it any less jarring when they're introduced, though. It feels wrong and unsatisfying that the main elves we meet don't have reactions to learning that their gods are evil, even though it's perfectly logical that these particular elves have already mostly had the time to process it. Such interesting reactions are relegated to the Codex and to notes found around the map, speaking to a storytelling that prioritizes momentum into the next bout of action, even if that pushes the broader world into the background. All throughout the game, the choice is made to tell a less emotionally interesting story, even while logically justifying it about as well as possible. There was a status quo for the elves that players of previous games would know, and it makes sense that the status quo has changed, but the game presents the new scenario post-change without conveying enough of a sense that the change happened. This is reflected in Arlathan Forest itself. The Veil is faltering here thanks to the residue of Solas's ritual eroding the already thin barrier. So there's a lot of floating chunks of land like we see in the Crossroads and the Lighthouse. Arlathan Forest is part of the mortal world, but it still feels like the Fade. It's a good idea and a way to hint at what Solas and the Evanurus want the world to more closely resemble. But by making it the first place we get a chance to explore to any meaningful extent, we don't get a good sense of what the normal state of the world has been after 10 years. The intro features tears in the veil that let demons through from the Fade. Then we end up in the Lighthouse, which is in the Fade. Then Arlathan, which is being intruded on by the Fade. Immediately after, we start exploring the Crossroads, which is part of the Fade. Conventional wisdom would dictate that it's better to establish the status quo that the events of the story threaten before being thrust into stranger situations, and that it would be good to firmly demonstrate a contrast between the Fade and the mortal world, since Solas's whole plan is removing that contrast. The way Veilguard does it is unmooring, disorienting, and the context of the rest of the narrative doesn't make such an effect seem like the intended one. The exact same disorientation is induced by the reintroduction of the Darkspawn. They look completely different now, again, having gone from Tolkien orcs in Origins, to more desiccated undead-looking warriors in 2 and Inquisition, and now they look like zombies with red lyrium sticking out of them. Also, before, only ogres were nudists, but now all of them are naked.
Other people will come here and see you nude. You like that? What kind of guy that you are?
They look like this because of Gillenane. The goddess has a talent for manipulating the Blight, and upon her release, she almost immediately gets to work experimenting with it, and so the Darkspawn look like this, like the versions she made in her lab in ancient times before her imprisonment. This isn't an out-of-universe redesign like in 2, this is an in-universe evolution. Or reversion. Either way, it's a change from what had been the norm. However, that is not communicated well at all. When the party first sees these Darkspawn, they immediately recognize what these enemies are, without a word on any perceived changes. The reaction is, oh no, it's Darkspawn, not, whoa, are those Darkspawn? Not too long after, there is a short remark that is so vague it still doesn't convey the idea that the Darkspawn have changed. It's just acknowledgement that something is off about them, as if it's some intangible change rather than an obviously new look.
You saw those Darkspawn, though? Something was different about them.
It's as if the line was written and recorded with the idea of a subtler redesign in mind, but then the art department went wild without telling anyone. I'm not saying that's what happened, just that it feels like that's what happened. And this is in the same mission as the surprising foreknowledge of the god's evil on the part of the Veiljumpers. It's a whole chapter of failing to set up what the before is in regards to the before and after the Evanurus return. Also, there's fantasy turret sections in this game. Okay. But I did mention this is when Bellara joins, right? I like her. She feels very reminiscent of Meryl from Dragon Age 2, but with a dash of Nenio from Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Her version of the introduce the companion by defeating an enemy in a dramatic way is probably the best one, because it doesn't just show her being good at fighting and striking a pose, it demonstrates her knowledge of ancient elven magitech with how she shuts down this construct. By the time of my second playthrough, her blabbermouth manner of speech had grown on me, and I find her endearing, but I'd be lying if I said she didn't annoy at first. Out of everybody, her dialogue skirts the closest to being consistently Whedon-esque. Her and a Rook who keeps picking the Whedon dialogue option. At least she is normally a genuine and sincere chatterbox rather than an eye-rolling snarker, but no matter how annoying the player may or may not find her, she is a good example of a distinct character voice, a manner of speaking that isn't easily confused with someone else. That's something the game's writing is pretty consistently good at, establishing clear voices for all the characters, even if what they say with those voices isn't always that interesting. And they may all be prone to snide remarks to varying extents, but they are BioWare companions, so that's to be expected. Also, her leitmotif, which doubles as Arlathan's leitmotif in general, is fantastic. The battle rendition that plays during her personal quest is probably my favorite bit of music in the game. I came to appreciate the music in general quite a bit more on my second playthrough. Inquisition still has the best score of the series with its consistent repurposing of The Dawn Will Come as a prominent leitmotif. Veilguard's score has its fair share of stock epic sounding tracks, but a lot of the more ambient or character-focused tracks are pretty good. After calming and retrieving the archive spirit for Bellara, the Veil Jumpers send Rook to investigate the quiet town of Demeda's Crossing. A couple jumpers went to the town but never returned, and it turns out that this is because the Evanuris came in and the mayor sold out the town to them so they could infest it with blight and boost their power. It's an effectively composed bit of scripted walking around and getting a sense of what's at stake if Rook fails. The entire world could look like this. While the strange, dangerous wonders of Arlathan Forest present a sort of twisted ideal of what the Sundering of the Veil might look like, this is the reality. At least with Elgar'nan and Gillinan on the loose. It's ugly and cancerous. And it is here where we get our first real, unambiguous confirmation that we're supposed to see the Blight and Darkspawn as different in-universe.
Ever seen anything like it?
Never. Blight's usually dead, static, but this is alive.
A bit late for that, I think, but better than even later or not present at all. While we're on the subject, I want to talk about the Darkspawn redesign itself. I've never really liked any of the Darkspawn designs. In Origins, they just look like Lord of the Rings orcs, and their pale, ghoulish redesigns for 2 and Inquisition are less derivative and, in my opinion, creepier, but also dial back the plague element, which is a core part of their identity. Now, the plague element has been elevated greatly. They feel like a primordial infection. The ambient patches of meat moss out of the Upside Down from Stranger Things are much more prominent. I had to double check that this was always present in Darkspawn-heavy areas in older games. That's how little of an impression it left on me in the past. All that is to say, while I don't love the Veilguard Darkspawn designs, I think they're closest to what I always wanted them to be out of the versions that we've seen. Of course, the otherworldly monstrousness of Gillinan and what her archdemon becomes is a major part of why I feel this way. In my broader retrospective on Mass Effect and Dragon Age, I said that I would think to picture something more unique than dragons leading orcs when I think about a corrupted god leading a plague horde. What I'd picture is more like this, especially Gillinan in the role of corrupted god. On the other hand, one could easily see the new Darkspawn as equally derivative as they were in Origins, only instead of Tolkien orcs, now they're like symbiotes from Spider-Man Web of Shadows. Or perhaps they're actually most reminiscent of the Reaper ground troops from Mass Effect 3. As I said, I still don't love the designs. The fact that they're almost all naked is weird, though it does make sense. These are formed out of raw blight patches rather than born from brood mothers into a cluster of camped-out Darkspawn that have armor and weapons for them to wear. It's another part that adds to the plague concept, conveying that these Darkspawn come into existence and immediately attack and spread their destruction, rather than take the time to get dressed for battle. If nothing else, the redesign successfully communicates things about how the Darkspawn function. After getting through the village, you meet the constricted mayor who sold Demeda's Crossing to the gods, and you get your first capital C choice. I guess choosing whether to talk down or beat up the people in the bar is the first. And there's which companion you take with you to get bonked on the head stopping Solas' ritual, but this one is the first that actually tests Rook's morals and has consequences later down the line. It's not a particularly great first choice, as the consequences are, which enemy faction will the mayor end up being forced into, Darkspawn or Venatori? It's the kind of choice that feels like it should end a side quest, not be the first one highlighted as a choice that will matter in a big RPG. Its main function is to be the first moment where companions will react differently to your choices. Bellara and Harding disapprove of letting the mayor go free, while Neve will disapprove of leaving him here. And in a later chat with Varric, Rook expresses anxiety over the fact that not everyone agreed on this course of action.
Not everyone was happy about my decision. We're just starting out and I'm already losing their trust.
Really, it's set up for the way the game brings the idea of choice and consequence to thematic centrality. Other Dragon Age games featured choice and consequence as central game mechanics, and they were narratively relevant for how the results of the choices affected the plot and revealed the themes, but in Veilguard, choice and consequence is itself one of the main themes. When we meet Morrigan after returning from the village, she really wants us to know that.
Prepare yourselves well and have a care in your choices. These are the times in which legends are born or slain.
In one sense, it could be taken as part of the overall lack of subtlety in a lot of the game's narrative, which can, at times, approach Saturday morning cartoon levels of blatantness.
He wanted a team he could rely on. We have to be that team.
Play to our strengths.
And rely on each other.
I think I can manage that.
A number of ideas are just spilled in front of the player's feet and then repeated so that we really get that they're important. However, considering that we went into this game already knowing Solas' general motivations being regret over the consequences of a past choice, it is certainly a fair and sensible direction to take for the story's core ideas, to really explore what it means to make hard choices and face their consequences. We'll get into the way the game doesn't fulfill the true potential of this theme later. As an aside before we move on, I wonder what kind of skincare Morrigan is using. We don't know her exact date of birth, but most fan speculation puts her in her late 40s or even early 50s at the time of Veilguard. Same with Isabella. And that makes both of them roughly older than Wynne is theorized to be in Origins based on side novels. Wild. But that Wynne speculation has gotta be off base, right? I like Morrigan in this game. She's obviously much more mature and understanding after 10 years living with a direct bond with Mythal. It's nice seeing how much she's grown, but some dialogue options can prompt some very old-fashioned, "What are you talking about, idiot?" remarks to slip out.
You are aware of what the word fragment means, are you not?
Her fashion sense is as terrible as ever. Rook returns to the ritual site to find the lyrium dagger that Solas used to cut open the veil. We get a short exchange where it seems like Harding and Neve are going to be at odds, but they start supporting each other like good mature teammates instead. This potential moment of intra-party conflict is quickly resolved. After a short chase with a Darkspawn who grabbed the dagger, Harding touches it, and it awakens a magic in her that dwarves aren't supposed to have. With the dagger in hand and the Evanuris left to try to make their own, we return to the lighthouse to process everything. After a short team meeting, Rook decides to set up their things in their private room to try to meditate and contact Solas to ask for advice. And since the game is sitting the player down to better define who Rook is, let's talk about how Rook functions as a player character. When RPGs have create-a-character protagonists, I prefer the game to leave as much characterization up to the player as possible, down to preferring unvoiced protagonists like we have in Origins or Baldur's Gate 3, to voiced ones like Shepard, Hawke, the Inquisitor, or Rook. At least the Inquisitor has comparatively fewer moments of automatic dialogue, but the other three frequently say lines without player input. In the best case scenario, such lines will be different to account for previous player choices. In the later stages of Dragon Age 2, Hawke says lots of things on their own, but these lines will be dependent on which of the three main personality types you have favored up to that point. So if you've been primarily playing an aggressive Hawke, the auto-dialogue won't suddenly start cracking jokes. After 2 playthroughs of Veilguard, this does not appear to be the case here. Or if it is not the case often enough. Despite picking the stern or angry options as often as I could for my anime crow, he still said a lot of the same things as my breezier hair metal wizard when I didn't get to choose for him. The moment in Arlathan Forest where Rook makes a barrage of hand puns after seeing the giant hand statue in the ground happens even if you have not made your Rook tell a single joke. The frequency of these auto lines leads to an impression that all Rooks are generally the same, which is not great if the goal is for the RPG protagonist to be malleable to player choice. It can be particularly jarring when the stern options are genuinely stern, only to be followed by an auto line of a different tone, usually veering closer to humorous. And make no mistake, some of the stern or angry dialogue lines can be quite harsh. There's an early one when you first meet the Veil Jumpers that surprised me with how rude it actually was.
You all were supposed to stop him.
Didn't see you volunteering. We put our lives on the line to stop Solas, and we stopped him.
However, when it comes to your companions, then the sternness fades, and instead the option just becomes supportive in a way that tells them to stay focused. I understand the decision behind this. RPG players rarely want to be mean to their companions, so if there was a way to simply give a different flavor of friendliness instead of taking away an option, that would be a better use of development resources. I remember the Never Knows Best retrospective on Mass Effect where he talked about making a failure shepherd playthrough, a shepherd who always made the wrong choices that got people killed and alienated them, only for the Citadel DLC to come around and act like everyone still alive was Shepard's best friend anyway, which completely shattered his investment in that playthrough. I'm not saying BioWare watched that video and designed Veilguard in response, but it does feel like an effort to avert that kind of ludonarrative dissonance by making Rook an immutably supportive person and good ally instead of trying to make radically different interactions with everybody. I understand why that choice was made from a practicality perspective, especially considering that development for the game had to be rebooted twice. The game's contrast between Solas and Rook is specifically written to posit Rook as a better kind of hero, and to tell that story, Rook can't be awful to their party like Solas often was to his followers. But this cuts player agency. It makes it feel like Rook can only ever have one relationship with the companions, and also eliminates the potential for a version of the story where Rook is actually worse than Solas, like the Darkside routes in the Knights of the Old Republic games. I'm also disappointed that it means there was no chance of another attempt at the friendship rivalry system from Dragon Age 2. Yes, it is better that you have 3 flavors of being nice to your friends instead of only 2 or 1, but there is a different psychological effect when you know that a mean option is there and you don't take it. There's a sense of greater possibility that is valuable in an RPG where choices have consequences. That said, there are some opportunities to be unsupportive, especially with Emmrich if you choose to have your Rook be consistently nervous about necromancy. It's just unfortunate that there is a rift within Rook as a protagonist, a conflict between the freedom of player expression that a creative character usually implies, and the predefined character with player choice limited to what's in character, like Geralt of Rivia, Ciri, or Adam Jensen. In Witcher 3, you can't make Geralt be mean to Ciri, and even if you try to cheat on Yennefer and Triss with each other, Geralt doesn't speak rudely to them. But that feels fine because you didn't create Geralt. It feels like BioWare wrote Rook, and to a lightly lesser extent Hawke before them, in the vein of a Geralt, or a Telltale protagonist, instead of a blank slate like the player character from Pillars of Eternity, Wrath of the Righteous, or a non-origin character from Baldur's Gate 3. Rook has to be a certain way to tell the story BioWare set out to tell, and that's not how I prefer RPGs like this to handle their protagonists. So, who is Rook? What are their predefined personality traits? Well, Rook is a good-hearted, heroic person who wants to help the weak. Rook is an empathetic, emotionally intelligent, and charismatic leader, almost like a good sports coach. Rook is afraid of making choices that get people they care about hurt. And Rook wants to be liked by others. That last part is a flavor that goes beyond a generic hero cutout and could be an interesting flaw, though not much is made of it. Rook is not quite a blank slate, but is very much a surrogate character. Someone defined just enough to have identifiable character traits, but not enough to really carry a story as a protagonist if they weren't controlled by the player. Their flaws are minor and easily surmountable. In other words, Rook is a classic dystopian YA protagonist. I think playing as the hair metal wizard leading into the friendly and joking tone worked well, but with my anime crow, it was unfortunately quite easy to see the game's seams. In other words, Veilguard is one of many RPGs that has a preferable way to play for optimal narrative immersion. It's a very common affliction, and Veilguard has an especially acute case. Hopefully one day we can find a cure. I do appreciate moments like this keepsake scene that let you actually define your Rook with a little more specificity. The choices you make here don't really come up later, unless you say that you're trans, which gives you extra options when you meet other trans or non-binary characters, but all of them are good ways to help you form a headspace for your Rook, and get you to consider if you want to play as more than just your own personality. It's not as effective at doing this as the Origins from Origins, but it's still appreciated. After you're done with the keepsakes, Rook meditates to talk to Solas, and once again, the scene is really good. Every time Solas is not on screen, I'm asking myself, where's Solas? These dream conversations are important for building an actual relationship between Rook and Solas, a very different kind of relationship than what Solas had with the Inquisitor, and in some ways a more honest one. There's a greater likelihood that Rook will start the relationship off on hostile footing, which means a lot more is in interpersonal flux as the two get to know each other better. After talking to Solas and checking in with Varric for more pep talks about what it means to be a leader, Rook reaches a decision to gather more allies after getting the Illuvian mirror working. This unlocks the crossroads, and in turn the pathways to go to the cities of Minrathous and Treviso. I chose to go to Treviso first because this run was as a crow and I wanted to see what returning to my background's hometown would be like this time. Being in Minrathous as a shadow dragon gave me a decent amount of extra dialogue and greater appreciation for that city, but unfortunately crows don't get as much in their main stomping grounds. No matter the background, the first visit to Treviso quickly establishes that the city is under occupation by the Ontom, the military wing of the Qunari that has broken from the rest of the Qun to go conquer freely. The initial run through the streets does a good job quickly establishing the occupation as a constant pressing threat in Treviso, which makes it all the stranger that after this point, when traveling around the city exploring or doing quests, the Ontom are barely a presence and mostly keep to themselves. While I like the Venetian aesthetics of Treviso, the overall plotline is a bit disappointing, but that's not apparent for a while yet. After this introductory stroll, we meet the Crows, who are acting as a righteous, scrappy resistance group against the Ontom, and learn that the man we've come to recruit, Lucanis, the demon of Varantium, has been captured by the Venatori and held in an underwater prison for a year while most of the Crows thought him dead. Ilario seems very upset that this was kept from him, because he's a good man who cares about his cousin, and he surely won't spend every subsequent scene behaving in increasingly suspicious ways. This transition is really strange. We go out on a boat, the crow we're with starts waterbending, and then cut, and we're just in the underwater prison. What? This is a moment that feels exactly like the old Dragon Age games, but in the worst possible way, and a throwback to how those games were made on rickety engines held together with chewing gum and loose thread that Markadera found in his pocket. The rest of the game is really good about maintaining its polished cinematic appearance, so this random bout of jank is striking. But what's more striking is the vibe of this mission. We're in an underwater prison run by a well-resourced secret society, here to recruit a companion as part of a story more focused on forward momentum and introducing us to characters than really exploring the implications of a changing world, while the music goes really synth-heavy out of nowhere. And this is the place where it really hit me. This is Mass Effect 2 and 3, especially 3. I'm fighting through a Cerberus base right now. The storytelling priorities in the later two Mass Effects and Veilguard are strikingly similar, with how they try for more soapish character drama and exciting action than anything else. Why is Shepard flying around shooting at Geth until the Collectors attack when Shepard should be entirely focused on Reapers? Shut up, watch this cutscene where the Normandy blows up. Wait, when did the elves learn that their gods were evil? Shut up, they did and they're your friends. Now here's a new companion and also Morrigan says hello. How was Cerberus able to storm the Citadel on such a large scale during a time when the station should be on highest alert because of the Reapers? And why would Udina think helping them was a good idea? Shut up, it's a dramatic action set piece and here's your new favorite character, Kai Lang. What does it mean that the Ontom have broken from the Qun, and how is that affecting everyone involved? Shut up, Treviso is under occupation and they're the bad guys. A major difference is that in Veilguard, these questions actually have reasonable answers instead of none. They're just shoved off into the Codex and not explored as much as they should be. But both cases are, as the late Seamus Young put it, drama first instead of details first. I feel like Dragon Age has always had more of an even balance between details and drama than Mass Effect, which started out firmly details first and swerved into drama first. In Dragon Age, the characters were always the priority, but many of their arcs were intertwined with details about the larger world. Iron Bull struggled with his allegiance to the Qun as he enjoyed a freer life leading the Chargers, and through him we got to learn more about the Qun. But this time, our Qunari companion is Taash, who was raised outside of the Qun before the Ontom even seceded. Their arc is about their gender and cultural identities. They are too separate from the Ontom to give us insight into what the seceded military is going through. The actionization of gameplay right down to turret sections is also reminiscent of Mass Effect, as is the Darkspawn redesign. Gillenane turned the Hurlock Darkspawn into Reaper husks that glow red instead of blue. Just like Shepard in 3, Rook routinely has automatic dialogue the player has zero input in. The party size is reduced from 3 to 2. The Archive Spirit acts like a Citadel VI. After partly resisting the gravitational pull of its sibling series aside from a voiced dialogue wheel, Dragon Age has taken the plunge and has now almost fully become Mass Effect. Anyway, Rook helps Lucanis escape from Wizard Cerberus, but the Venatori who ran the prison is still out there, and Lucanis has been experimentally bonded to a demon of spite, an ill-tempered creature who sure does seem like he'll cause problems for our new companion. And now it's time for Neve to take us on a tour of Docktown in the basin of the Tevinter capital city Minrathous. Ever since Dragon Age Origins, we've heard of Tevinter as a mage-dominated, imperialistic adversary full of slavery and blood magic. It's the sick old man of Thedas, at least as Brother Genetivi describes it in his lore writings, lost in bitter reminiscence of its former glory. The way Veilguard chooses to convey this is interesting. Docktown is geographically in the lowest point in the city, surrounded by building-lined cliffsides that stretch up towards the floating Archon's palace. It evokes the incredibly literal upper city-lower city divide seen in works like Alita Battle Angel. And as ambient dialogue reveals, the omnipresent rain that falls upon the streets to make it even more of a fantasy noir city is a direct result of the magic used to keep the Archon's palace floating in the sky. The class divide is influencing the weather here, drenching the poor with the excesses of the ruling mages. The overall design of Minrathous makes the whole city appear reminiscent of an archaeological dig site, with Docktown near the bottom and the various catacombs we can explore reaching even deeper. It's a remarkably fitting way to depict the capital of a failing empire on the precipice of either radical reform or reactionary collapse. Throughout the whole series, we have met characters from Tevinter who testify to its greatness, insisting that its past glory still elevates it above places like Ferelden or Kirkwall. Inspired by Corypheus, the Venatori have abandoned Andrastianism and returned to venerating the old gods who tricked the ancient magisters into breaching the Golden City. They're digging through the past to justify their efforts to take over the Imperium. Other forces in Tevinter that are not necessarily Venatori but are still interested in upholding its slavery are also stuck in the past. By limiting us to Docktown for most of the game, by making us feel like we're at the bottom of an archaeological dig, Veilguard conveys Minrathous' struggle with its own past, and how that struggle most significantly harms its ordinary people without a single line of dialogue. If I recall correctly, prior to Veilguard, the characters from Tevinter we got to meet were either magisters and their immediate devotees, or escaped slaves. Even Dorian in Inquisition was still from a magisterium family, and in Veilguard he is now a magister himself with the potential to become Archon. So we've primarily been seeing the extremes, the peaks and dregs of the Imperium, with nobody in between except, I think, for Krem. So now that we're finally visiting Tevinter, we are visiting a working-class neighborhood, mostly filled with ordinary people. If there are slaves out and about, they're indistinguishable from everyone else, and the average person in this area is certainly not in an economic position to own any. So the part of Minrathous that we see is very much like any city, with workers, beggars, merchants, and guards here and there. It's not as crumbling as Brother Genetivi made it out to be in his writings, and the magic street signs that imitate cyberpunk-esque neon signs attests to a degree of advancement like Dorian described in Inquisition. It is, on the whole, a good taste of this city's less fortunate side. I am disappointed that we only get to see Docktown, but I imagine that if we got the original iteration of the game that was supposed to be a Tevinter-focused heist, we would have seen a lot more. And like everything else in this game, a lot of the interesting local politics are relegated to Codex entries, like this one transcribing Dorian arguing with another Magister and storming out of the Magisterium. Much of what we've expected to see of Tevinter based on the extreme representatives we've previously been exposed to is largely off-screen, beyond the pedestrian concerns of Docktown. But make no mistake, while the fishermen here cannot afford slaves, it's clear through dialogue and Codex entries that the abolitionist fight of the Shadow Dragons is a major conflict in the nation, though of course the game is telling us about that struggle much more than it is showing us. Our tour with Neve takes us through much of this zone until we find a Magister's son engaged in some shady behavior. Rook beats him up, and then the authorities arrive to give us an all-too-familiar demonstration of the kind of two-tier justice system in Minrathous that Neve has spent her life fighting against. The Magister's son walks free and unpunished, while the smuggler he was dealing with, who it later turns out was being mind-controlled into being here in the first place, is arrested. I like noir. Blade Runner and The Third Man are two of my all-time favorite movies, so throwbacks and genre mashups like we have here appeal to me. The way Minrathous riffs on noir tropes is nothing groundbreaking, but it works well enough to give the area its own fun flavor. So while we don't get too involved in the inner workings of the city beyond this one part of it, I like the snippet we got. This is true of most areas we visit, but especially Minrathous. There's no need to recap the back and forth between the end of the first quest in Minrathous and the warehouse investigation that leads to meeting the First Warden and Dorian, so skipping ahead to that, the First Warden is a stubborn jerk who thinks that only he and his people can solve the Blight and refuses to recognize that things have changed. The First Warden is voiced by Nicholas Bolton, also the voice of Male Hawk. And come to think of it, in Inquisition endings where Hawk is alive, they apparently go to Weisshaupt with the Wardens and all news out of the fortress ends. No, this is just BioWare recasting an actor they enjoy working with. It means nothing more than the mayor of Demeda's Crossing sharing an actor with Loghain. Unless... Anyway, the First Warden's obstinance, first introduced in this meeting in Minrathous, helps another major theme of the game emerge, the necessity of accepting change. Most of the antagonists are antagonists for their insistence on refusing to let things change from what they were familiar with, whether that means pretending change doesn't exist like the First Warden, or trying to drag the world into a past state like Solas, the Evanurus, and the Venatori. It's oddly fitting for Dragon Age, a series that has always reinvented itself with each installment, returning after 10 years with yet another reinvention, to write a story largely about how things change and how trying to make the old retvern or freeze things in place will destroy the world instead. When the First Warden insists on arresting Rook, we're saved by Dorian, a major agent of change in Tevinter as one of the leaders of the Shadow Dragons and the main reform advocate remaining in the Magisterium. Quite fitting. Dorian threatens the First Warden into standing down, and Rook returns to the lighthouse, disappointed that the Wardens don't seem to be willing to help with the new Super Blight. However, Harding is able to go behind the First Warden's back, introducing Rook to the Grey Wardens Antoine and Evka, who in turn set us on the trail of the monster hunter Davrin, our next party member. Davrin is the first of two companions who is introduced to us not with a cool combat maneuver to defeat an enemy or several, but with a moment that speaks to other aspects of his character. He arrives after the Griffin Hassan shows up to immediately calm the animal while warily interrogating Rook about why they're at his camp. Davrin is presented to us not as a killer, but as a protector, and as someone who prefers to do things his way but will begrudgingly accept changing circumstances when he has to. This not only relates to how his relationship with Hassan will evolve, but also to how Davrin is, in many ways, the best embodiment of the Grey Warden ideal as a guardian of others, a stark contrast to the portrayal of the First Warden. This is also the first time in the game where we see something that contradicts what was assumed to be common knowledge. The Griffins were thought extinct, but there's one right here, and the characters remark on it right away instead of waiting several minutes to hours and leaving the player wondering if there's been a retcon or not.
I thought Griffins were extinct.
We want the world to think that. It's why we're training in the middle of nowhere.
This mission, recruiting Davrin, is where the game's most glaring narrative weaknesses up to now begin to recede and the game starts to find its proper footing. Let's talk more about that theme of change. What to do about this changing world is a question all the major factions are asking themselves. I've already spoken about the first Warden refusing to admit that the Blight has changed, and how the Venatori are trying to stamp down the anti-slavery efforts of the Shadow Dragons after defeating Dorian's Lucerni party in the Magisterium. Elgar'nan and Gillenane speak of a new world they can bring, but it's really just returning the world to what it was like under their control. Elgar'nan especially speaks about how the world has degenerated since his time ruling over it, and how he is the one who can lead his followers back to glory. Then there's Solas, whose goal is to tear down the veil he created because he sees the world that has emerged since as so degraded, so inferior to the one there was before it, that he wishes to burn it all down to bring back the past. But he doesn't want to just bring back the past exactly as it was, he wants to specifically curate what is to return. He wants the good of the Evanuris' reign, but without the bad, without the Evanuris themselves. He wants to bring back the past but make it better, and he is treated more sympathetically for it. But even this, Veilguard says, is misguided, unacceptably destructive, at least in the widespread, imposed way he intends. Antoine and Evka have to take over to make the Grey Wardens adapt, and by the end of the game, the entire Order is going to face the massive change that there will be no more capital B Blights to prepare for, but they face that future with optimism. The Veil Jumpers have embraced the changes brought about by the weakening of the Veil to learn more about the world and their people, in the hopes that they can, perhaps, curate some of the things to bring back in less destructive ways than Solas would. The Veil Jumpers would learn and incorporate past good into the future instead of try to revert everything. The Crows and the Antam are huge missed opportunities to go deeper with this theme. From Codex entries and a couple findable notes, it's clear that there is a crisis of purpose among many Antam now that they have left the Qun. The Dragon King turns to the idea of power by birthright, while the Butcher actually begins to embrace a modicum of change. The Crows have changed, but largely off-screen. In Dragon Age Origins, Zevran describes the Crows as brutal and ruthless killers, so cruel in their training and recruitment methods that he wishes to join the hero of Ferelden's party to escape them. By the time of Veilguard, they have become righteous freedom fighters in the face of Antam oppression, and while their past cruelty is not contradicted, it is not addressed either. The various factions within the Crows have come together to fight the Antam. Some, surely, are more brutal than others, and it's reasonable to assume that there would be a lot more infighting than we get to see in the game. Treviso's questline could have easily involved different factions trying to pull the Crows in different directions. Viago and Tea would likely be the voices for changing the Crows into a more heroic and romantic ideal, while some rival character could cling to the brutal traditions Zevran suffered from. The omission of such a subplot is glaring because it would have fit so perfectly with the game's thematic goals. The Shadow Dragons even have a less severe version of this type of disagreement, where Dorian and Maevaris Talani debate whether they should take a more ruthless or inspirational approach to rooting out Venatori and other anti-reform magisters. Well, they have the luxury of this discussion if you keep Minrathous safe from a dragon attack. Speaking of which, after recruiting Davrin and having your first meeting with his subplot's villain, the Gloomhowler, Rook takes him back to the lighthouse, only for other companions to run up and say that two blighted dragons are attacking Minrathous and Treviso simultaneously. Lucanis will go to Treviso, Neve will go to Minrathous, and Rook has to decide whom to support. My Shadow Dragon Hair Metal Wizard saved Minrathous, of course, and so Anime Crow will now save Treviso. This is perhaps the most significant choice in the game, at least with regards to how much it changes your experience for the rest of the story. Whichever place you don't save will be dramatically damaged, the allied faction there will be hurt, the relevant companion will become hardened, and quests in the area will be altered. If Treviso is not saved, its canals will be blighted and the Antam occupation will be complicated by plague and darkspawn. If Minrathous is not saved, the Venatori will assassinate the Archon of Tevinter and take over its government, launching a purge of Docktown that publicly kills many Shadow Dragons and forces them even further underground. It's an interesting idea, and like nearly every interesting idea BioWare tried out in Mass Effect and Dragon Age, this first iteration is clunky and doesn't work nearly as well as it should have. In theory, this choice adds replay value by giving you drastically different experiences for Minrathous and Treviso. In practice, whichever area you don't save simply ends up losing some of its most interesting related content. If you save Minrathous, Lucanis is hardened, and as a result, he won't want your help dealing with spite and resolves that subplot on his own. off-screen, and in doing so comes across as a much less interesting character. On the other hand, if Treviso is saved and Neve becomes hardened, you still get the most critical scenes for understanding her development. In both cases, the hardened companion ends up choosing the more pragmatic and pessimistic resolution to their side quests without letting you influence them, but only Lucanis actively hides his character arc from you. So for a better rounded experience with all of the companions, save Treviso. But on the other hand, doing so cuts out a lot of the interesting stuff in the Shadow Dragons plotline. A saved Minrathous is, at least in my experience, the only part of the game where you get to have individual one-on-one conversations with faction leaders to get to know them better as characters. You know, like you might do in a BioWare game. It also features Shadow Dragons making plans to take over the Magisterium once the Venatori are defeated, and that causes Maevaris and Dorian to have their aforementioned debate about inspirational example setting versus ruthless pragmatism. It's not a particularly deep exploration of this dichotomy, but it's more than the crows get even in a saved Treviso, and it is a key moment in elaborating on the game's themes of change by giving Rook a moment to ponder what route to change they think is best. If Minrathous is not saved and the Venatori gain power, you don't really resolve anything, you just see the results of the Purge and save the Viper, and that's it until the finale. Meanwhile, the Treviso story arc always gets a resolution. It's the opposite of what happens with the city's respective companions. So the choice is really this. Do you want a complete story for both cities but an unsatisfying arc for Lucanis, or do you want a complete story for both Neve and Lucanis but an unsatisfying arc for Minrathous? Instead of getting a good branching story, you're just choosing a specific arc to make worse for yourself. My preference might be to save Minrathous. A blighted Treviso also adds a much more oppressive atmosphere that the normal occupied city is mostly lacking after its introduction. So Rook and the team confront the dragons and manage to chase both away, but not without extensive damage to the city Rook does not go to. Rook chats with Solas to ask for advice, and the Dreadwolf seems to be warming up to Rook a little bit by now. He advises Rook to seek out an expert on the Fade and a dragon hunter, and luckily Bellara and Harding have candidates for each role. If the Mournwatch and Lords of Fortune were supposed to be truly relevant to the main story at some point, most of that must have gotten cut. As it is now, they are snippets of Navarra and Ravain, even less substantial than what we get to see of Tevinter and Antiva. Halloween's my favorite holiday, so I like the fun spookiness of Navarra's necropolis, but we don't really get a good sense of what normal life is like in these two countries. We are seeing parts of Thedas that we have never seen before, but not in a way that massively expands what veteran players already knew about them. I don't think this is inherently a bad thing, at least looking at the game on its own terms, but it is surely disappointing for those who wanted more in-depth explorations of Ravain and Navarra. The good thing is that Emmrich and Taash are well-written characters with strong introductions, and at this point in the game, the average moment-to-moment writing quality is settling to being roughly on par with or only slightly below what it is in the other Dragon Ages. There are broader weaknesses I've already discussed, and some I will detail later, but on a scene level, it mostly works now, with the exception of scattered moments that stick out as condescending or like first drafts they didn't edit into being more subtle. Case in point, right after recruiting Taash, you can talk to them about the Lords of Fortune, and they're quick to reassure the player, which in this case means social media critics, that the treasure-hunting pirate faction is unproblematic and they don't steal from oppressed cultures. I have no problem with this in concept. The Lords are ruled by Isabella, and the last time we saw her carelessly steal a cultural artifact, she almost got Kirkwall destroyed. Combined with her big sister friendship with Meryl, and now her good working relationship with Tosh's mother Shathan, it makes sense that Isabella would make sure the Lords of Fortune are conscientious about what they do with cultural treasure they find. The problem I have is that Taash just brings it up unprompted. Now, here's the redemptive reading of this moment. Taash has already been well characterized as incredibly blunt, and perhaps the Lords of Fortune are so often suspected of stealing from Dalish or whoever else that Taash is being preemptively defensive on their behalf. It doesn't quite come across that way though, especially because there's another way this is brought up that is much better. There's a bit of companion banter I didn't get footage of on this playthrough between Bellara and Taash, where Bellara is grilling Taash about the Lords of Fortune being treasure hunters. hunters, obviously suspicious that they've been looting from Dalish ruins. As a Dalish researcher with a vested interest in her people's history, Bellara has every reason to be skeptical of the Lords of Fortune. If this was expanded into a full scene where Bellara confronts Taash on her suspicions, and this is how the ethical plundering was made clear, and Taash's line to Rook I just discussed was cut out entirely, that would be a far more natural way to bring this up. As it is now, it reeks of defensive writing, or writing to preempt criticism, writing with fan opinion far too much in mind. But I've spent too long on a point of criticism when I just said that this kind of scene is the exception to how most of the writing is at this point. Emmrich and Taash both have good introductions that characterize them well, much better than the intros for Harding, Neve, and Lucanis. Emmrich is immediately understandable as a cheery gentleman who also happens to be a necromancer. He's like a Disney princess, but a middle-aged man, and instead of a sassy animal, his sidekick is his delightful skeleton manservant, Manfred. As the oldest member of the team, he is also a sensible avenue through which some of the more, shall we say, HR-friendly moments of companion interaction can come through in a characterful way. Emmrich is a joy to be around even before you get into his deeper aspects. Perky but death-related is a well-worn trope because the contrast is obvious, but some things are cliches because they just work. Taash is the opposite, a young, emotionally immature, blunt dunce who at first has no interest in helping the team, but really hyperfixates on how cool dragons are. It's admirable how efficiently this recruitment mission manages to convey Taash's multidimensionality compared to how flat most of the other companions start out as. I really like this funny moment when Taash just is not getting that they're being recruited because they're so fixated on this dragon.
So, what do y'all do?
Right now, we're trying to take down evil god monsters and their blighted dragons.
What? That can't be right. Dragons don't get blighted. They're smart enough to avoid that crap.
However it's happening, the gods are using the blight to force dragons to attack people.
That's messed up. Somebody needs to stop them.
It's also clear what Taash's flaws are that they will need to overcome. Davrin is the only other companion with a strong arc setup. Davrin needs to become more nurturing and accept his role as caretaker, and Taash has a lot about themselves to figure out as they are not only caught between Qunari and Rivaini culture, they not only have rare fire-breathing powers, but they are also struggling with their gender identity and, most importantly, dealing with a harsh mother who is completely out of her depth raising a child. Taash is what happens when you strictly homeschool your kid, and their lack of social grace also immediately brings more friction to the group dynamics, which makes the lighthouse livelier for a little while. The Veilguard is now assembled. The team is still hopeful that Antoine and Evka can help convince the other Wardens to listen to them about how the Blight has changed, but also, Morrigan has an old friend she'd like Rook to meet. I quite like how this Inquisitor's appearance turned out for a version of the character I never actually played. Like I said before, I wanted to see an Inquisitor who romanced Solas but then resolved to stop him by any means necessary in this playthrough. Unfortunately, I think the romance overrode stop by any means necessary for most of the lines where it would have actually mattered, but I kind of expected that. I don't think even the best RPGs would be likely to have combined those two variables in an interesting way, so I set Veilguard up for failure here. Sorry. It's like when I decided to roleplay a fall from good to evil when I played Jade Empire, which that game was not at all equipped to handle. The presence of the Inquisitor hammers home an aspect of the choice and consequence theme that has been steadily building as we learn more about Solas, and as Varric regularly advises Rook on leadership. Rook is faced with several examples throughout the game of those in a similar hero role that present possibilities for what Rook could become. The Inquisitor is obviously the previous player character, who had to make a lot of tough decisions that shaped the world we're in now, even if we don't get to see a lot of it. As such, the Inquisitor is primed to be a mentor figure as Rook is trying to figure out how best to lead. In the Crossroads, we get to see several memories of Solas during his rebellion against the Evanuris, and we see his own decision-making in moments like what to do with a follower who has been blighted, or whether to sacrifice an army of allied spirits in order to succeed in a dangerous mission. Less obvious examples of heroes who make the wrong choice include the First Warden, the Gloomhowler, Bellara's brother Syrian, and, if you really want to stretch it, the Mayor of Demeda's Crossing. How does Rook compare to these other examples? What can they learn from the consequences of these prior choices? And most importantly, can Rook accept the consequences and keep pushing forward? This only comes to a head at the end of the game, but the Inquisitor here helps set it up.
We did our best.
but our best had consequences.
Another major role the Inquisitor has is to be the source of the only choices from past games that are actually incorporated into Veilguard. I was pleasantly surprised how little I felt the game stumbled over itself to keep other things vague, and perhaps the lack of deep exploration of the regions we do visit means that non-specificity about the state of things in southern Thedas fit right in. There are some minor details that indicate choices being made for us. Codex entries about the Antom's secession make it pretty clear that Sten is the Arishok now, which means that the hero of Ferelden let him join the party instead of leaving him to die in Lothering's Crossing. Though I suppose one could easily headcanon that Sten always survives and just fights the Fifth Blight on his own if he's not in the party. But also, there are hints of Zevran running around as a rogue crow, killing off the cruelest crows and possibly paving the way for their heroic turn, which means he survives Origins too. Most significantly, the events of this game imply that Morrigan did not perform the Dark Ritual and have a child to carry the Archdemon Arthemiel's soul. Maybe I'm misreading, but later in the game it's revealed that the Veil is tied to the lives of the Evanuris, and because the Evanuris' lives were tied to the dead Archdemons from past blights, Elgar'nan and Gillenane are the only Evanuris still alive, so their deaths mean the Veil comes down. If Arthemiel's soul survives in Kirin to be taken by Flemeth and then presumably Solas, then wouldn't that mean the elven god it's tied to is still alive? Unless Solas destroyed it himself off-screen and unmentioned? Maybe I'm wrong, and if it exists, the Arthemiel remnant would be too weak to sustain the Veil by itself. But if I'm correct, then anybody who really hates this game has an out. Veilguard is only canon in world states where the Dark Ritual doesn't happen, so just get Morrigan pregnant, be free, and rage no more. Shh. It's okay. But let's talk about what it means that Veilguard is the first Dragon Age game to not import save states. Apparently BioWare wanted to, but they ran into problems with the Dragon Age Keep, the program specifically designed to enable easier save state transferring after the console generation changed between Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition. I don't know what these issues were, but even without them, trying to make a satisfying incorporation of all possible choices from previous games is an impossible nightmare. Origins and Inquisition both allowed the player to do things that would logically result in radically different worlds, but the practical realities of game development mean that everything needs to be redirected back into the same general shape for the next installment, which is often unsatisfying in its own way. The Dark Ritual choice in Dragon Age Origins means that there may or may not be the remnant of an archdemon's soul floating around in the world somewhere, and if Flemeth didn't show up to basically take it out of play in Inquisition, the logical ramifications of what that would change in the world would be enormous. So Flemeth did take it out of play, essentially nullified a player choice because its implications could not be handled by any game that has to be made under conditions of limited time, budget, and resources, which is all of them. Former lead writer of Dragon Age, David Gator, made several threads on Blue Sky about his writing for different Dragon Age characters, and he had this to say about Kirin. Here's the thing about honoring previous game choices from a design perspective. It's a sucker's game. What many fans picture when you mention it is divergent plot. The story changes path based on those major choices. How exciting. But you will never be able to deliver divergent plot. You can deliver flavor differences, usually in the form of divergent dialogue, character swaps, character X appears instead of Y, and extra content, such as a side quest. But plot branching, particularly the critical path? It's a question of resources, and there's never enough to go around. Here Lies the Abyss in Dragon Age Inquisition was about as good as it gets, and even that was a far cry from how I originally pictured it. Hello last-minute insert of Stroud when a Dragon Age Origins Warden import got cut. The old god baby was one of the main choices from Origins. Morrigan has a baby with the Archdemon's soul? Most Origins players who flagged that choice surely expected monumental consequences. World-shaking consequences. And we talked about it. We did. There were like 3 different designs of the Inquisition ending where old god baby Kirin could cause complete divergence, new path, cutscenes, the whole 9 yards. But it wasn't going to happen. It was a decision from 2 games ago that only a small minority, hello telemetry, would even choose. To the rest, they probably neither knew about it nor cared. So how many resources could you invest? To do what? Set up an even bigger divergence for the next game? So, with all that in mind, I do not envy BioWare's constant difficulties implementing player choices across games, even if that is an expectation they set for themselves. The shift in setting and scope from Ferelden to Kirkwall in the first two games was a good way around this, making it reasonable to expect only flavor differences. In theory, this could have worked for Veilguard as well, but whatever technical issues the team had with the Keep meant they decided to just write the South as vaguely as possible and only incorporate a few key Solas-related choices from Inquisition to be chosen at the start of Veilguard, and craft the rest of the plot to not need to incorporate anything else. Truth be told, they did a pretty good job at that. It was surprisingly easy to consider my playthroughs of the earlier games as still relevant. The game has taken a path of non-contradiction instead of incorporation. There is only one glaring omission. If a Warden, Alistair, Loghain, or Stroud survived the fate in Inquisition, what are they up to now, and how are they reacting to what happens to the Wardens in this game? Have they left for their calling already? Everything else I can reasonably accept as not relevant to the events of Veilguard, and however disappointing it may be to not get any more old choice incorporation, I hardly consider it some fatal flaw. I don't know how future Dragon Age games, if there are any, will move forward, but it doesn't bug me in Veilguard. I do wonder what Colin's up to, though.
Well, that's enough.
With the Inquisitor met and the full team assembled, Rook's next move is to go to the ssburg wetlands in the Enderfells to help Antoine and Evka investigate the Blight, in the hopes that they can convince the rest of the Wardens to help out. I have nothing to say about this particular section of the story, so let's actually talk about what the gameplay is like. How far into the video are we? With Veilguard, Dragon Age has finished abandoning the more tactical real-time with pause combat that Origins had, and has become a full-on action game. And I think it's much better than the strange hybrid system in Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition. I don't think it's necessarily better or worse than Origins, since they're just different systems. And since the series' trajectory has been to keep actionizing, I'm glad Veilguard did it so well. The inclusion of stagger meters, status effects, elemental weaknesses, and status detonations really helps mitigate the damage sponge problems that plagued 2 and Inquisition. The character building that emphasizes different elements of combat creates a system that I imagine has a lot of discoverable depth, but is also perfectly playable on a shallower level. I'm not the kind of in-depth gameplay aficionado who makes sure to master Bayonetta and S-rank every encounter, so I may be off base, but I have the impression that there's a lot to play around with here. I just know that I built my hair metal wizard around powerful arcane bombs that heal on detonation, and that there were other playstyles I could have focused on more. So there is still a sense that you are making a specific build. In a world where we have more pure RPG alternatives like Baldur's Gate 3 and especially Wrath of the Righteous, I'm more willing to accept Dragon Age actionizing its combat. The one thing I do wish had been retained since Origins was the dialogue system, but we've already talked about that. The one thing I didn't say before is that it's a shame that the only extra dialogue options you can get are based on background, rather than the knowledge specializations you can get in Inquisition or the persuasion checks in Origins. Dragon Age has never excelled at incorporating character building into its conversations beyond species differences, but there are certainly a few moments where I wish I could at least attempt persuasion. Instead, it's just choose which path you want to take and you will take it, which is another way Veilguard is designed more like a Telltale game. But BioWare games have lacked my preferred dialogue design element since the first dialogue wheel popped up in Mass Effect, so alas. The game plays well, is what I'm saying. The loot system also ended up growing on me, even though I usually like more old-school inventory systems where you just assemble huge amounts of trash you have to sell. Here, you can find better versions of equipment you already have, and it automatically upgrades the old stuff instead of adding a new, better version into your inventory. It's streamlining for sure, and is likely a remnant of the live service version of the game, but I ended up liking it, especially with how higher tiers of weapons and armor can synergize with the skill web. I wouldn't want it to replace all other loot systems, but it worked fine. Once Rook collects enough samples of Blight Boils, Antoine is fully on board with recognizing the changes to the Blight. Unfortunately, the First Warden is still being as stubborn as ever, so he summons all available Grey Wardens to Weisshaupt and nearly gets the Order wiped out. Rook chats with Solas again, and I want to point out a particular element of this conversation. Solas keeps grilling Rook about how they will get the Wardens to help, and the game presents a series of answers that Solas keeps shooting down until Rook agrees to do whatever it takes. Through its conversation mechanics, the game is depicting Solas essentially badgering Rook into giving him the answer that he wants, which is that Rook will be as pragmatic as Solas believes he had to be. Considering that Solas later claims he molded Rook into someone like him, this is important. I'm torn on whether I wish something like it had happened more than once, or if doing so would have worn out the trick and made it just be repetitive. Regardless, Rook takes the entire team through the Alluvion to Weisshaupt Fortress and finds it in the midst of an overwhelming siege. This part of the game is awesome. The presentation of this apocalyptic siege truly drives home the monstrous threat posed by the Darkspawn, and Gillenayne's face in the clouds like she's telling Simba to remember who he is looks fantastic. This is a true capital B blight right here, and in this moment Gillenayne feels like an archdemon in a way Urthemiel and Origins never did. The way the battle becomes more desperate as Darkspawn pour over the walls and you hear the bells to fall back and eventually make a final stand lend the exact sense of desperation a sequence like this needs. There is one problem I have, and that is the option to talk down the first Warden. In most other RPGs, I would think this would be a persuasion check, or perhaps it would require you to find a specific item or piece of information that prompts reflection, which actually is how you can talk down Solas and the Gloomhowler. But here, you just pick whether you want to punch the first Warden in the face or try again to convince him, and this time talking just works. If you talk him down, the dialogue itself doesn't feel like it earns the sudden change of heart. This is no Legate Lanius here, but it's not a big problem. There's just a sense of, wait, was that it? That gives a blemish to an otherwise perfect action set piece. It's not stated outright, but I think part of the first Warden's obstinacy is overcompensation for how badly the Wardens screwed up at Adamant Fortress in Inquisition. Grey Wardens in general are not valued as much when a capital B blight is not happening. And even though they stopped the fifth blight, the last few decades have not been particularly good for the reputation of the Grey Wardens. Those who went to Ostagar were branded traitors and mostly wiped out, severely reducing the Wardens' numbers. The fifth blight never made it out of the kingdom it started in, and it was defeated mostly by 2 rookies relying on the help of many non-Warden allies, meaning the rest of the world would have barely noticed it and thus not been forced to remember the importance of the Wardens. Then, when the Breach Crisis happens, the Wardens are all played for fools by the Venatori and had to be kept in line by the Inquisition. I can easily see the first Warden here feeling that the Grey Wardens must reassert themselves in the world and reclaim the respect he feels they lost. Of course, this inability to deal with change makes him even more vulnerable to its effects. It's an interesting choice to let us finally visit Weisshaupt for the first time after hearing it mentioned as the home of the Grey Wardens for 3 prior games, only in the context of it getting destroyed. I don't see this as a repetition of the problem I had with the Veiljumper introduction, though. It's not a problem of poorly setting things up. The effect this has is continuing to push the image of what this place must have been like into the realm of the ideal. Davrin speaks of Weisshaupt with reverence and fondness, even as he admits how unglamorous it could be. And the Gloomhowler misses it so much, she leads in the creation of a replica in the Deep Roads. So we as players only ever see it as a faraway reference to a home or as something lost, or in the process of being lost. The ideal of the Wardens as great heroes has been challenged since the moment Duncan stabbed the one guy who didn't want to go through with the joining. And now, another piece of the archetype of a legendary order, the idea of an impenetrable fortress they can always go back to, has been taken away. The Wardens are being broken down, but are primed to be reshaped, as Gillenayne reshapes her archdemon. In the moments Weisshaupt falls, the future looks bleak. But if you see the ssburg arc to its end, there is a lot of hope to be found in the freedom to grow in wildly new directions that the remnants of the Wardens have. A silver lining to one of the darkest events in the entire series. Davrin deals the final blow to the archdemon, fully expecting to die and more than okay with it, but the monster's soul returns to Gillenayne instead and turns her mortal. Lucanis launches himself at the goddess to deal the killing blow, but she knocks him back. And with the element of surprise gone and Gillenayne in a rage, the party decides to retreat and fight another day. In another moment of clunky overtness, Emmrich goes out of his way to say that the party has unfinished business and that they all need to do their side quests in order to be focused on the job. Similar conversations happened in Mass Effect 2, but I recall them being slightly more elegantly conveyed than this one. Slightly. Also, Davrin and Lucanis are feuding now, with their pre-existing dislike for each other's professions escalated by what they saw at Weisshaupt. Varric tells Rook that it will take time for the plot to advance, so, might as well advance some companion arcs in the meantime. But before we do any of that, let's chat more about Solas. In the Crossroads, you can find several memories of Solas fighting his rebellion against the Evanurus that you get to relive in the role of one of his followers or agents, depending on the scene. At the end, you get a wolf statue. After meeting the Inquisitor, you get another wolf statue, and then unlock the ability to use the statues to restore a series of murals in the lighthouse that reveal even deeper memories about him and Mythal and how they're kind of responsible for every catastrophe in Thedas. I don't know if this is common, but I did the memory missions as soon as I could, and then when the Inquisitor gave me the last statue and the ability to see the murals, I did all of them at once. So, let's talk about all of them at once. The Crossroads memory missions all show Solas at the height of his heroism, but with several moments of him making difficult choices that reveal his darker edge. Every time we see Solas caught between callous pragmatism and selflessness, he chooses the former every time and then feels bad about it. These missions also give us a glimpse of Gillenane back when she still looked like an elf, and we get a hint at deeper elements to her character that unfortunately don't amount to much. Solas says that she used to be kind, but she replies that she essentially cast off her kindness for the sake of power. Meanwhile, Elgar'nan appears to be exactly the same kind of megalomaniacal tyrant he acts like in the main story. Solas' right-hand elf Felisan tries to push back on Solas' ruthlessness while still remaining loyal, and it's brief but good. We also see that Solas used to have hair, and he's probably better off bald. But Solas' deepest regrets are sealed up in the forms of murals. The choice to depict these moments this way could be a result of budgetary constraints, but the effect they have is an implication of such deep shame, such deep repression, that these moments can only be remembered in their impression rather than their full detail. And they certainly depict things Solas has reason to be ashamed of. Taken in total, Solas' memories reveal pretty much every lingering mystery that the Dragon Age games had left. Almost as if the 10-year struggle to make this game a reality compelled the creative team to simply share what they had planned and wrap up every loose thread so that, at the very least, longtime fans could have answers and closure. I'm of two minds about this. The more negative mind says that part of the appeal of Dragon Age lore was the ambiguity, the contradictions between sources, the fan theories, the fact that nobody in-game knew everything except a handful of cryptic characters who would never give it all away. Dragon Age lore was often written to resemble the ambiguity of real-world history, with biased sources and different viewpoints that had completely different explanations for why the world is the way it is. So to then give us definitive answers for every question in the lore except is the Maker real or not and where do the Qunari come from removes a lot of the fun mystery and speculation. And with the Evanurus at the root of all of it, the problems of the world can be laid at the feet of just a few people, which makes the world feel smaller. On the other hand, I think all the reveals we get are awesome and only make more sense the more I sit with them. In fact, while double-checking some stuff on the Dragon Age wiki, I found quotes from Cole in Inquisition and especially Trespasser that hint very directly at these mural reveals. Despite making the world feel smaller, mythologies being connected doesn't feel as wrong as, say, revealing the disconnected actions of mortal characters were all part of one big plan all along. It also helps that these moments as depicted are instances of characters reacting to situations and problems that arise organically, rather than it all being part of some secret plot. I wonder if this had all been revealed since Origins, and was thus an accepted fact of the world as opposed to a reveal 15 years later, would I think it was cool? I think I would. These memories reveal the origins of the elves and elven gods, the origin of the Blight, the truth of the Black City, and what happened to the Titans. Oh, and not in these scenes but in a dream conversation with Solas, he reveals that the archdemons were actually all dragons that the Evanurus enslaved and implanted bits of their souls into, so we know where archdemons come from too. That's a lot, but it fits together. It makes sense why the Darkspawn retreat underground in between major blights now, since their hive mind comes from the lobotomized forms of the mostly underground titans. It makes sense why Flemeth, holding the soul of Mythal, was so interested in possessing the soul of an archdemon. It especially makes sense why Solas is so against Cole choosing to become human in Inquisition. He had undergone spirit-to-flesh transformation, and it kind of resulted in everything being ruined. He wants Cole to stay a spirit like he wishes he had done. You can tell that these reveals were meant to be the answers since at least Inquisition, and the seeds of them surely started earlier. In David Gator's Blue Sky thread about Flemeth, he mentions that in Origins, he knew all along that her backstory involved her gaining power from an elven spirit, but not necessarily Mythal. So I imagine that all of the answers we're getting in these murals were gradually developed behind the scenes until they were mostly decided upon by the end of Trespassers' development. Revealing the Blight to be the disembodied dreams of Titans recasts what was once a simple tide of inhuman destruction into a representation of the lingering pain and suffering of ancient misdeeds. And I think it's neat that Gillenane uses the Blight as a tool of creation when it comes from the Titans, beings who once reshaped the world itself as they walked within its earth. The question remains, where does the Maker fit into all of this? The game does not disprove the Maker's existence, only the specific doctrine of the Chantry's history. In response to this mural, and Harding fearfully asking what these revelations mean to Andrastianism, Rook can say as much.
The Chant of Light might be wrong, but it's been made and changed by people over 1,000 years.
There was a whole verse about an elf named Shartan, and the Chantry just cut it out.
So maybe the Golden City was meant as a metaphor, or maybe it was added because of politics. That might change the history, but it doesn't have to change your whole faith.
The oddest parts of these scenes are the party's little recap "What have we learned today, kids?" sessions after each mural. The mural parts are really well written, but the recap parts can fall into clumsy condescension, especially the very first one. The rest of the recap bits are better because they come across more like the characters themselves are theory crafting and coming to conclusions. Neve talking through it like she's investigating a crime is a good touch, as is the aforementioned moment of Harding questioning her faith, or Davrin wanting to keep the knowledge hidden because he's worried about racist backlash against the elves from the rest of Thedas if they were given reason to pin the Blight on elves too. I feel like these recaps could have used a bit more ironing out to really nail the feeling of being character-driven rather than having a lot of...
Everybody got that?
But again, after the first one, they get better. And I also like how the dialogue choices here are ways to further define who you want your Rook to be. Something else that's interesting is that the first mural features the Evanurus engaging in very mundane politicking. The one bit of the subsequent party theory crafting that isn't just recap is everyone expressing disappointment in how much like mortals the gods are.
It was so mundane. Nothing grand or cosmic. No setting fire to the sun, just talking politics. I wish they were monsters. Something grand and terrible. Seeing them like that, they're no better than Tevinter nobles.
But no worse, either. They were people. And people can let you down.
Yet, instead of the game going with the obvious follow-up, that the Evanurus were just powerful mortals, we get the spirits reveal. So, in this way, Veilguard is emphasizing one or both of two possibilities. That spirits, especially back then, were quite close to mortals in their mindsets, and/or that taking flesh introduced such petty concerns to once pure spirits, which is how Solas talked of how spirits work in Inquisition. It could be both, and Solas could be exaggerating the latter as a way of placing more blame on the decision to take form rather than anything the spirits brought with them. After finishing the last mural, Morrigan shows up to tell Rook about Mythal and draw their attention to a separate fragment of the goddess who can be talked into helping. Talking to Mythal is also great.
We saw Solas's memories, his regrets.
You saw the recollection he cultivated like a tree twisting to catch the sun. You wish for my help? Convince me.
It's a simple conversation puzzle where you have to make sure your tone is not too sympathetic, but also not too dismissive. And along the way, Mythal gets to be fleshed out more as herself, not just filtered through Flemeth or Morrigan. With the exception of clunkiness in the team recap sessions, all of this is fantastic. Some people may feel it reveals too much, and sometimes I agree, but everything fits together so well, and, most importantly, it enhances the characters of Solas and Mythal. They are both flawed, prideful individuals who wanted to do good, but both at various points let their hubris get the better of them. Mythal believed she was good enough to temper Elgar'nan until he and the other Evanuris killed her for trying to limit their use of the Blight. Solas, partly because in ancient times his reservations around the actions of the gods seemed to all have been proven right, now believes he always knows best. He is a particularly self-pitying kind of remorseful, one whose need to be right prevents him from truly accepting the desires and autonomy of those around him, especially in modern day.
The elven people of today do not deserve to see the world they love be torn apart to salve your conscience.
These two gods are right out of Greek tragedies, or what the tragedies may have been like if the self-destruction of those works' mortal heroes were ever applied to the infamously flawed Olympians. I'll give each companion their own spotlight section later, where I talk about their characters and their story arcs, but right now let's go over how they interact with each other. Setting aside the writing itself and focusing on the mechanics of how these interactions are presented to the player, Veilguard is probably my new gold standard in all of RPGs, or at least close to it. I like it when companions have clear relationships with each other and don't just feel like they're only friends with the player character. The one major weakness of the Mass Effect 2 party is this lack of interpersonal dynamics beyond a handful of barely explored exceptions. Veilguard makes great strides in making the team feel like a team. We don't just get one potential intra-party romance like Tali and Garrus or Dorian and Iron Bull, we get two, with the pairings of Taash and Harding and also Neve and Lucanis being possible, as long as the player doesn't get in the way. There are quite a few cutscenes dedicated to developing the companions' dynamics, and also, just like in Mass Effect 3, they regularly leave their designated quarters to visit each other or chat in common areas. Most of the things I said in my BioWare retrospective video that I wanted more of with regards to party dynamics, Veilguard delivers. After 2 playthroughs, I can confirm that many, if not most, of these non-cutscene chats are the same exchanges that would occur in on-the-field banter, and that is an absolutely brilliant design choice. It addresses my longtime problem with field banter as the main way of conveying party dynamics, which is that unfavored party members end up losing out on the potential to be developed and win the player over. Sure, you can find a banter trigger point and walk across it several times in a row, but there should be a way to build party dynamics in a way that happens reliably in natural play. Up to now, the Pathfinder games were some of the only RPGs I've played that I feel do this well, because banter happens whenever you rest, and you have to rest a lot. By making banter lines trigger at the home base instead of just out on the field though, even companions you don't take with you have a chance to actually interact. Yes, the way the companions wait for you to walk up for a second or two before starting feels staged, but it's a huge step in the right direction. Unfortunately, these lighthouse banters still aren't quite enough, especially if you're being efficient about doing the main story and companion arcs. It seems like they don't start up until several lighthouse returns in when most of the party has been gathered, and certain lines are prioritized depending on player progression. What this means is that banter establishing and fleshing out the beginnings of companion relationships can get skipped over in favor of remarks on major events or each other's quest lines, and the latter two types tend to be a lot less interesting. The early dialogue often involves companions not getting along about one thing or another. Davrin and Lucanis do not respect each other's vocations. Neve finds it off-putting how much Bellara seems to idolize her. Most people, but especially Taash, are weirded out by Emmrich's necromancy. People are wary about Lucanis' possession by spite. Bellara is suspicious that Taash and the Lords of Fortune have been looting elven ruins. These are all fun starts to relationships. Meanwhile, a lot of the plot commentary are lines that generally amount to variations on, "Oh wow, what happened at Weisshaupt sure was messed up." or hey, sorry about the thing happening with your nemesis, hope you're doing okay. So much of the initial friction between party members only happens in banter, but that banter can be missed and overridden by progressing too much too fast. My first playthrough, I got to see a lot of the conflict between Emmrich and Taash before the scene where they make up, but I didn't see any of the banter building up Taash and Harding's mutual attraction until after the cutscenes where they actually start dating. In my second playthrough, it was the opposite, where I didn't get to see any of Taash and Emmrich butting heads, but did get to see Taash and Harding flirting a little. Ideally, I would have seen both build-ups before their respective payoffs in both runs. In my first playthrough, I missed the rivalry between Lucanis and Davrin until they start arguing after Weisshaupt, and then they make up seemingly just as quickly. In my second playthrough, I made a point to take Lucanis and Davrin with me more often, and, sure enough, they do talk about how Lucanis doesn't like Grey Wardens and Davrin doesn't like crows. In combat, the barks they say in response to the other getting a kill is a lot more challenging and competitive than the supportive good job remarks other companions give each other. So hopefully there is or can be a mod to boost the frequency of Lighthouse banter scenes, especially early on. Otherwise, a lot of the moments of early party friction get lost in the shuffle and the game speedruns the party into a perfectly harmonious group of friends, where everyone gets along and is really supportive of each other. And some of these scenes do strain credibility for just how supportive they can be. The bit where Taash and Emmrich resolve to make peace about Tash's unease with necromancy feels particularly Sesame Street. The fact that you can see this while possibly missing the much more interesting lines of banter between them establishing the conflict is baffling. I don't think it has to be a rule that companion dynamics need to all at least start out hostile, and in fact Mass Effect 3's generally excellent companion exchanges on the Normandy are almost all friendly and supportive, with most exceptions coming from Javik. Though to some extent, this is made less obvious by the existence of the prior two games. Garrus and Rex are more hostile in the first game, but are very chummy by the third. Dragon Age companions have tended to be a bit more hostile to each other than Mass Effect, though not universally. Origins definitely has the most combative party, with Leliana and Wynne generally getting along with everyone, but the rest of the companions being more standoffish, and Morrigan and Alistair's rivalry being especially legendary.
No one in your life loves you. Everyone also hates you.
Oh, yeah.
And that you will die lonely.
Oh.
You are a turd. You will never find love either.
There's a mix of friendliness and hostility in the parties of 2 and Inquisition, with strong friendships on display between Isabella and Meryl, or Solas and Cole, for example, or Varric and everybody. But even Origins never had the sense that everybody is always at each other's throats like we got in, say, Knights of the Old Republic 2. Now, in Veilguard, the hostility is more missable, and the wholesomeness is played up. As I said, I wish the early moments of conflict were more pronounced, but many of the friendship moments are well done for what they are. I like the strong sisterly relationship that grows between Bellara and Neve, the parenting discussions Emmrich and Davrin have about Manfred and Asan, Bellara and Emmrich being excited research buddies.
Though we'll have some difficulty citing our sources.
Right, I guess Solas's memories are technically a diary?
Bellara and Davrin bonding over their experiences as elves, just Bellara in general, the Codex entries with companions cross-referencing each other's notes, and the book club meetings. With a handful of exceptions, mostly in how repetitive the sorry about your nemesis banters can be, the scenes of friendship are successfully executed. There may be an imbalance in just how much the friendship is emphasized over the moments of conflict that are there, to the point that it can feel like the writing team is putting Tumblr coffee shop fanfic into the game itself, but on the other hand, this creates the effect of making the lighthouse really feel like the sanctuary Solas built it to be. This structure was a safe haven for Solas and his rebels during their fight against the Evanuris, and freed slaves frequently took shelter here. Now that the Veilguard has moved in, it is a place of safety from the overwhelming destruction of the 6th Blight. The entire world is under siege. Some areas are noticeably bleaker than others, but evil is everywhere. Nowhere is safe. Nowhere but the lighthouse. If, as Patrick Willems describes in his Sweaters video, true coziness means there is darkness and danger outside, but safety inside, the lighthouse is absolutely designed for maximum coziness. I think less harmonious dynamics have the potential to be more interesting overall, which is one of many reasons why I prefer KOTOR 2 over KOTOR 1. And the party being so supportive of each other by around the midpoint of the story contributes to a broader simplification of morality into mere good versus evil, like how Inquisition became by the end of its first act. When Dragon Age does morally gray, it tends to do it well, including the rare moments it appears in Veilguard, so it's a shame most of this game doesn't bother. But on the other hand, the cozy feeling of the lighthouse to contrast the apocalyptic threat of the Evanuris and the Sixth Blight is successfully created, so I can say that I don't like the universal wholesomeness as much as more contentious RPG parties, but I feel it would be unfair to say it's bad, a couple moments notwithstanding. Shortly after Rook helps certain team members get their heads back in the game, the Wardens send word that one of the blighted dragons that attacked the cities has been spotted in the wetlands. The Veilguard travels there to plan an attack with the Wardens, and sends word to either the Crows or Shadow Dragons to come help, depending on which faction was spared the full force of the attack earlier. Taash helps lure the dragon out, and the heroes attack. This is another great action set piece, especially when Elgar'nan and the second dragon appear and the second ally faction joins in. After the Pyrrhic victory at Weisshaupt, this is a moment of triumphant hope. Though it is not such an overwhelming victory that the threat of the Evanuris is suddenly diminished. The structure of Veilguard's plot is excellent for feeling like a series of moves and counter-moves between heroes and villains. Inquisition's main antagonist Corypheus has one major victory when he destroys Haven, and then has his evil alliance dismantled into irrelevance bit by bit. For many, this made him pathetic and totally neutered his threat. It can be difficult to maintain narrative tension in a video game because standard storytelling models dictate the heroes struggle and fail before they win in the climax, but games require player success at every progression point. So any game developer with a desire for a standard story structure needs to figure out the balance between player success and antagonist threat. On one extreme, you can get Inquisition, where the hero succeeds at every turn, and by the final battle, the villain is the one flailing desperately. On the other hand, you can get a situation like the Kai Lang Thessia fight in Mass Effect 3, where the game throws a pointless boss battle at the player that they win in gameplay, but Kai Lang wins in a cutscene. And a game full of Kai Lang Thessia fights is non-stop frustration that should usually be avoided unless you're making, like, a game where you play as Sisyphus or something. The first two Dragon Ages get around this problem by having different structures. Origins is video gamey. It's the classic BioWare structure of, here's some places you can go to in any order, they have their own local conflicts you can solve even as the main threat is still out there, that we saw in Knights of the Old Republic and Mass Effect 1. Dragon Age 2 has its episodic structure, with conflicts that are separate but still lead directly into each other, and swaps main antagonists between each act. Meanwhile, Veilguard succeeds in the more standard story structure by giving the players small victories that chip away at the Evanuris, even while the Evanuris demonstrate their overwhelming power and remain a threat. At Weisshaupt, Elgar'nan's archdemon is killed and she is rendered mortal, but she destroys the Grey Warden's millennia-strong fortress with an overwhelming tide of darkspawn and slaughters most of the Order. Early on, Rook finds and takes Solas' ritual dagger before the gods can get it, but this only delays them, and they are capable of slowly making their own. In a later mission, freeing Dalish prisoners thwarts Elgar'nan's plan to sacrifice them for power, so he sacrifices his own followers instead and gains the power anyway. And here, in this fight with the two blighted gods, Rook and their allies manage to kill both of them, and Rook almost kills Elgar'nan, but Elgar'nan arrives and easily halts the attack and rescues his fellow god in a way that effectively demonstrates his power. Every blow dealt by the heroes is met with a counterstrike or deflection by the villains, and the conflict feels dynamic. Each side is reacting and adapting to the other, instead of a situation where you have some sort of inscrutable main villain plan that goes on basically uninterrupted until the heroes finally stop it at the very end. I like it. As I said, the team takes down both dragons and almost Gillenane too, until Elgar'nan saves her. Rook overhears him mention something's going on in Arlathan, which gives the team a clue for what to do next. But of course, everyone also still has personal quests to resolve, which the game is really insistent that the player do.
So we help our allies.
And track down the gods.
And maybe deal with our own crap when we've got time.
It gets a little bit silly how frequent these, "Hey player, remember to do all our side quests" exchanges get in the last few main missions before the point of no return. But now's as good a time as any to start going through the companions one by one. Lace Harding was a side character in Inquisition, a friendly and loyal recon scout who would give the Inquisitor the rundown of each new area. You could flirt with her, but this never amounted to anything. She was beloved by players, so BioWare gave her some extra focus in Inquisition's Jaws of Hakkon DLC, and now have promoted her to companion and made her a romance option. I never cared about her much before, and I still don't. Sorry. She's a pleasant presence, but was never all that interesting. In Veilguard, she is primarily a vessel through which the increasingly elf-focused series can still tie the Dwarven people in. She touches Solas' ritual dagger, which connects her to the ssburg, the song of unity that the dwarves all felt when they were part of the Titans, and that the Titans presumably all felt with each other. The same sense of unity that became corrupted to form the Blight hive mind the Darkspawn are part of. Harding gains the ability to use magic, one of 2 or 3 dwarves to have the ability, depending on how you interpret Sandal. The other, Shaper Volta, has become the Oracle after the events of Inquisition's Descent DLC, and helps Harding understand what happened to her. You know, I wonder if Varric got to hear the ssburg after Solas stabbed him. If touching the knife is all it took to awaken Harding to it, stabbing surely would be an even more substantial connection. Anyway, Harding's journey takes us to Kal Sharok. We get to see a bit of a Kal Sharok outpost and get to know a little bit about how their culture is more flexible and adaptable than Orzammar's, which ties in with the broader themes of both choice and consequence and the necessity of accepting change. Kal Sharok's leaders had to make incredibly difficult decisions that ultimately did allow them to survive cut off from Orzammar. While its dwarves are still in some small, undefined way exposed to the Blight, they persevere, and have even abandoned the caste system. It feels like Kal Sharok should have been its own area, and I'm sure it was planned to be before it was cut down to simply being part of Harding's missions. The Codex is divided by major allied faction, with entries covering the groups, the relevant part of the world they operate in, or the related companion. The Dwarven people have their own section too, but Kal Sharok is not mechanically an ally like the Crows and Grey Wardens are. It would have been nice to get to explore this Taig as we did Orzammar in Origins. Oh well. Harding's most interesting character trait is her repression of her anger, and unfortunately that only comes up twice, maybe 3 times. In the scene where she pretends to like coffee so Lucanis won't be offended, he realizes that growing up as a surface dwarf, she tried to bury any aggression and be likable and agreeable to everybody around her as a defense mechanism. Then, in the climax of her questline, it turns out that this very tendency caused her to expel the anger and rage she felt at what happened to the Titans into the heart of one, creating a shade in her own image that lashes out at the nearby Kal Sharok dwarves. Taken together, a new theme just for her questline is clear. Repressing anger helps no one. You must allow yourself to acknowledge it to truly move on. Harding can move on either by embracing her anger or choosing to take comfort in her friends. The way it plays out, one could easily mistake the take comfort in friends route as a form of repression, but I think the intent is that Harding is sharing her anger with her friends to diffuse it, rather than burying it within herself like she had been. The 2 scenes dedicated to her suppressed anger are not enough to drive the point home. It doesn't feel like a fatal flaw has been overcome as much as a personality defect is discussed once and then becomes plot relevant for one mission. Harding does briefly lash out at the Oracle for being cryptic before suppressing it, and we needed more moments like that. In context, it doesn't feel like her burying her anger in an unhealthy way, just her being understandably frustrated at the Oracle being cryptic, something that Stalgard also expresses irritation with.
She does that. Riddles, riddles, riddles. Oh, I'm a rock.
So I like the idea for Harding's arc, it just doesn't feel as in focus as it should have been. This is a problem with all the companions' major character flaws to some extent, except for Taash and Davrin, but Harding definitely has it the worst. For most of her screen time, she is likable and friendly in a fairly unmemorable way, and this normalcy also makes the moments of her anger poking through seem more reasonable than I think they're meant to. But her epilogue sticks the landing and gives her storyline a satisfying resolution that ties in well with the rest of the game. Whether she herself decides that she cannot be stuck in the past and obsess over the crimes committed against the Titans, or the Oracle pushes her in this direction, she is able to move on as she looks over the very obvious Titan mountain. The Titan here is a lot more on the surface and far easier to reach the heart of than the Titan from the Descent DLC. Perhaps it was because it fell to rest in the mountains rather than deep underground. Also, maybe the Titan we can see here is not the only one in this mountain range, and the one where we find the Shade is actually another smaller one. Whatever, the point is that Harding does not stew in the injustice done to the Titans, and does not fall into the trap of trying to resurrect some long-dead glory days. She accepts, even in the anger route, that the Titans' time is over, and while what happened to them was horrible, she must take her knowledge forward, as more dwarves may potentially gain magic and create something new. Change is often violent and can leave injustice in its wake, but it cannot be undone. Harding trying to form some Titan revivalist force would have made her no better than the Venatori, and her efforts no less futile.
Destruction is change, sister, and we are still changing.
Change happened. In this case, it sucked. It should not be forgotten or buried, but remembered, and then incorporated into whatever comes next. So, I like her fine, I just don't care about her that much. She's the Caden, or Jacob, of Veilguard. Perhaps I feel down on Lucanis because my first playthrough was the one where I saw his arc get cut off because I saved Minrathous instead of Treviso. Lucanis is a quiet and reserved assassin, cordial and good-hearted, but one to keep his problems to himself. And if he's hardened and doesn't think Rook would be a good person to talk to about his problems, he does keep them to himself and just resolves his subplot with spite off-screen. This makes him come across as much less interesting, which is a shame because an assassin possessed by an uncooperative demon is a great initial hook, possibly the best one in the whole party. Let's recap real quick. Lucanis was captured by the Venatori and taken to their underwater Cerberus base, the Ossuary, to be subjected to Zara Renata's demon experiments. She has been trying to find ways to create specific demons and implant them into non-mages, which should not be possible, and she found it humorous to do this to an assassin with the nickname the Demon of Verantium. She wanted the demon, Spite, to completely overtake Lucanis, but the two of them made a deal. Spite would let Lucanis keep his body, as long as Lucanis freed both of them from the prison. But even though the Veilguard frees Lucanis, Spite is still not satisfied, and insists Lucanis is going back on their deal. When Lucanis first joins, all the companions are put off by the problem Spite could cause, and Lucanis pushes himself to stay awake because it's easier for Spite to possess him when he's sleeping. The build-up to a disastrous backfire is effective.
Let me talk to them! I want to talk to
Lucanis!
Nope. It's fine. I'm fine.
But then it doesn't really happen. Again, Lucanis can actually just deal with his problems by himself if Treviso is blighted, but even if it is saved, the payoff to the Spite problem happens in a fairly safe scenario. When Tea and Viago meet with Rook and Lucanis and Minrathous, a missed opportunity to have the crows comment on what the safety of Treviso cost now that they're actually in the other city, Spite decides to bring Rook into Lucanis' mind to try to resolve their problems. As it turns out, Lucanis' trauma has kept his mind trapped in the ossuary. Mental projections of other people in his life tell him that he's untrustworthy and a failure, and his possession and imprisonment make him worthless to those he cares about. He doesn't just beat himself up over failing to kill Elgar'nan at Weisshaupt, but over getting captured in the first place. Lucanis is a perfectionist, and like most perfectionists, he catastrophizes even understandable failures. The perfectionistic obsession over past mistakes is one of the mindsets that can lead to the change intolerance that the rest of the game's narrative opposes. It's a mental recycling of the past and a refusal to move on. Rook helps him come to terms with these insecurities and encourage Spite and Lucanis to either coexist and accept their new situation permanently, or agree to find a way to separate peacefully after the Evanuris are dealt with. It's a huge mistake for this to only be visible in some playthroughs. Without it, Lucanis' arc is just limp, because the other major component of it, the betrayal of his cousin Ilario, is not executed particularly well. The main reason is that Ilario does not get enough screen time dedicated to the good side of his dynamic with Lucanis. We get his mask of concern when Lucanis is revealed to be alive and then returns home, which is fine but fairly non-specific, and then every scene until his treachery is revealed is mostly dedicated to him acting very suspicious. Without us getting to see real sentiment between them, it makes the pain Lucanis feels at Ilario's betrayal feel hollow. The two are said to have been close as brothers, and it would be nice to get to witness moments that let us feel it. There are certainly opportunities, like the two of them and Rook talking at the cafe, or when the Crows are planning Katarina's funeral, but the Ilario is suspicious beat is played too loudly to get a good sense of anything else. Aside from simple jealousy, why does Ilario want the role of First Talon so badly he will sell the Crows out to the Evanuris? I'm not sure. If the game featured more of an ideological split between the Crows like I pitched earlier, where some wanted to change into being more idealistic protector types while others wanted to retain their brutal tactics and rule Antiva with fear, then perhaps Ilario could be one of the latter who resorts to allying with the Venatori to get his way. Lucanis' story has the outline of a Shakespearean tragedy, a betrayal by a man regarded as a brother for the sake of taking over a noble house in a backstabbing-prone city. But it is unable to have the impact it could because one major component might be left out of the game entirely and another is presented too simply. This leaves Lucanis as a soft-spoken coffee addict and chef who is able to endear himself to the rest of the team enough to be easily accepted in spite, of the demon possessing him. Bellara is the exact kind of cute, excitable character I can see being very divisive. Either she is an adorable small bean, or an annoying motor mouth whose patter is repetitive and loud. I lean more on the former side, especially after 2 playthroughs in a romance route, but I can see the latter, especially when her "I mean" vocal tick happens too often in a single conversation. She also suffers from a muddled character arc. Her first major scene is fantastic, where we see the sadness and self-punishment underneath her excitable exterior because she is guilty about her brother Syrian's apparent death. She can be a little reckless with magical anomalies when she's dealing with them directly, but extremely paranoid about safety checks when other veil jumpers are involved, indicating a possible death wish for herself while also wanting to make sure nobody else she cares about gets hurt. I really like this element of her character, but it feels like it gets dropped when her brother turns out to be still alive and in the service of Anaris, one of the elven gods deemed part of the evil pantheon who wants to build his own empire in opposition to the Evanuris. Then her arc becomes more about struggling with the possibility of having to kill Syrian. This too is interesting, and indicates a rich new approach to the theme of change. What do you do when someone you love has changed into your enemy? But Syrian is not really an enemy, and Bellara is able to convince him to turn on Anaris. This leads to his real death, but Bellara no longer blames herself. She recognizes that Syrian's own choices led to his death. She just hurts because she still loves her brother. Her quest ends with the choice between keeping Anaris' archive spirit so that parts of the past can be preserved and learned from, or wiping the slate clean entirely. This choice feeds back into the game's broader themes of change, but this wasn't really a question she was struggling with up to this point. Yes, she is distressed by the revelations of the crimes of the Evanuris in ancient times, but that isn't necessarily the same thing as struggling with what to do about the archive spirit. She's already known that her gods were bad, she's just started seeing it up close now, and she was looking for the archive spirit anyway. Bellara's arc is about her dealing with guilt for getting her brother killed, until until it's about her dealing with her brother changing into someone she likely will have to kill, until it's about her deciding whether or not the risks of keeping the past around are worth it. And Bellara's personal journey through these points does not feel like a complete arc. Also, her side quest is one of 3 companion stories that features a loved one sacrificing themselves in order to strike a blow against the companion's personal nemesis. All of these play out in unfortunately similar ways, and Bellara's is perhaps the one I find least effective. I never cared that much about Syrian and didn't feel much when he dies turning on Inaris. Though I did feel sad for Bellara during his memorial. Her arc would have been better if she either couldn't talk Syrian down or if Syrian never survived, and she had to deal with overcoming her tendency to blame herself for his death, and Inaris could tie into that. All of that said, I like Bellara's role as the heart of the Veilguard, and her excited sincerity does a lot to smooth over some of her more annoying moments. She shines within the context of the Veilguard as a team, and her perspective on elven lore plays off well against Davrin's more worldly approach, but I wouldn't blame anyone for finding her sickeningly quirky. I'm a sucker for film noir influences, like I said before. Neve is a fun iteration of the jaded but heroic private eye, who doubts the world can change for the better, but tries her hardest to help those around her anyway. We're gonna need a lot of people like Neve Gallus in the real world, I'll tell you what. A lot of her scenes take clear inspiration from classic noir in the way she talks and her view of her city. I particularly enjoy how romancing her ends up casting Rook in the femme fatale role, with her nicknaming them Trouble. It's corny for sure, but corny in a fun way.
Minrathous, the heart of Tevinter. Somehow the beast of it always pulls me back.
Her take on the change theme is that she has been trying to make a difference in Tevinter, but doesn't seem to be making any progress. As we see with the way the Minrathous Templars help cover up Venatorian indiscretions, her ability to take down the corrupt sources of all the troubles in her world is limited. The villain of her arc, Aelia, is an old adversary who has escaped justice before. So she has become weary, and she has 2 paths towards revitalizing her approach. She can either become a symbol of hope for the downtrodden of Minrathous, or a more ruthless protector with the help of the Threads gang. While most of the game features characters who refuse to accept change around them, Neve demonstrates how one can face a situation where change is desired but cannot be achieved. I like that her arc is not shoved off screen if her city gets wrecked like Lucanis. She doesn't feel like she has the luxury of choosing to be an inspiration and automatically chooses to join up with the Threads, but at least you get to see the major beats that lead to this decision. The game also does a good job demonstrating Neve's ties to Docktown by establishing her friendly relationships with its everyday people. From the fish merchant we see in a cutscene to the child whose pet she finds we get a Codex entry about, Neve's status as a folk hero and her care for Docktown is well established. Certainly better established than the colonists we're supposed to care about in Mass Effect 2. Her arc plays out in a manner very reminiscent to a superhero comic, especially one of the lighter-toned Batman ones. Unlike the previous 3 companions I spoke about before, I don't think there are any major flaws within Neve's arc, with the possible exception being Aelia, who is a pretty flat and one-note villain. But aside from that, it all works fine. It's just not interesting compared to the arcs I have yet to mention, and especially compared to the best companion stories from prior games. The noir pastiche isn't much more than a functional pastiche. It isn't like some Disco Elysium level spin on the genre. It's like one of the average noirs from the classic Hollywood era that was competently made and then forgotten. Back in the main plot, returning to Arlathan Forest leads Rook to discover that the Venatori are kidnapping Dalish to sacrifice them for a ritual meant to power up Elgar'nan. Rook and the team infiltrate the gathering, and Bellara and Neve manage to work together to break a mind control spell that Elgar'nan is casting over his audience. This is the most significant non-Codex glimpse we get into how Elgar'nan controls his followers, by using magic to weaken their will as he whispers promises to them that he can give them what they want. It's another instance of, this is the bare minimum, but it's there. Though, as a Shadow Dragon, Elgar'nan made promises about Tevinter's glory, which I wouldn't think would entice someone dedicated to reforming the Imperium and wresting control away from those who are obsessed with its past glory. Perhaps Elgar'nan's temptations could have been tied to the choices you made in the reflection scene before your first chat with Solas. I'm assuming this isn't already the case because the game absolutely would have had a telltale style "Elgar'nan knows that you said in the mirror that you thought you looked hot" notification. This would have been a great way to tie in the character-defining choices you made in a more substantial way than simply helping you as a player decide how you want to play your Rook. But oh well. This is the first time Elgar'nan really takes center stage as an antagonist, and I find him less interesting than the already thin Gillenane. He's voiced by the guy who played Nier in Baldur's Gate 3, so it's nice to see that great villain voice being used for a villain who isn't such a loser. Elgar'nan isn't pathetic like Nier is, but he is a fairly generic tyrant. He's a little more complex than Corypheus, and certainly more competent, but has fewer cool lines, so it kind of averages out as far as memorability is concerned. But then, halfway through the mission, he traps the party in a mental maze, and Solas is able to use his tie to Rook's mind to taunt Elgar'nan and distract him. And once again, Solas elevates everyone around him. He accuses Elgar'nan of deteriorating over the years, of losing his intellect and simply relying on brute power. Even someone claiming to represent a superior past in a fallen era is lesser than he once was. You can feel the weight of the history between these two gods, who hate each other for being mirror images of each other's pride. Elgar'nan's simplistic characterization sharpens when explicitly contrasted with Solas, embodying the Dreadwolf's arrogance and manipulation without the self-awareness and self-pity. And this gives another opportunity to develop Solas, who speaks with Rook after the Veilguard has escaped with the Dalish prisoners, and expresses appreciation for the chance to be an unambiguous hero again. It's the same reason he freed the slaves in Tevinter before enacting the ritual, but this time there was no later atrocity hanging over the deed, or at least not such an immediate one. After debriefing with the Veiljumpers, the Veilguard determines that Elgar'nan seeks to complete his replacement for the Lyrium ritual dagger during the next eclipse. The game doesn't say how long exactly this is, just that it's not too far away, and I really like this choice. RPGs have long had a problem creating a sense of urgency while also allowing freedom of approach and giving players enough time to do all the side quests they'd want to do. Most developers give up and let the immersion break. Mass Effect 1 lets you take your time and do as many side quests as you want, even with a main quest literally titled A Race Against Time. Mass Effect 2 changes the rules and actually does give you a time limit, but because that's so rare in the genre, it can still feel like a cheap surprise. So with Veilguard, there is a ticking clock, but there's no in-game calendar system, and the team's use of the Illuvians to warp around Thedas means travel time barely exists. The game is actually able to have its cake and eat it too. The villains are going to enact an evil world-ending plan at a specific time the characters know, but it's left vague enough for the player to justify taking as much time as you want to finish up side content. There are so many small things like this that have plagued RPGs for ages. The question of plot momentum while letting players take their time, how to make sure companion banter is not missed as often, the push and pull between protagonist and antagonist. Veilguard makes great strides in finding solutions for all of these, but the comparative weaknesses in its actual writing means that unfortunately but understandably, these strides may be overlooked. But whatever. We are explicitly told we still have time to finish up our companion quest, so let's do that. Emmrich is delightful, but beyond his sunny disposition, he has a deep fear of dying. He acquired this phobia when he was orphaned, and ironically was raised by the necromantic Mournwatch, meaning he was surrounded by reminders of his fear and continued to dedicate himself to that environment anyway. It's an interesting idea, and the scene where he discusses this with Rook may be one of the best single scenes in the game, especially if we ignore all the ones with Solas.
It goes beyond dread. Can't be reasoned with or soothed over. It comes without warning. In the dead of night, in sunlit streets, a raw, strangling fear struck somewhere deep past the heart.
Despite his gentlemanly friendliness, he is also one of the companions who has the most friction with the others. Pretty much all of them, except Bellara, with whom he already has a positive pen-pal relationship, are disturbed to various extents by his necromancy. This is certainly something that could have been played up more if the goal was to have a more contentious party, and some more drama and humor could have been wrung out of his friendliness and genuine desire to get along with everyone else even as they're freaked out by his magic. His story arc dealing with his former friend Johanna Hezenkos is fun, especially with Manfred getting involved in the finale to help infiltrate the soiree at her haunted manor. It's one of the few moments where the quest design is slightly more varied, with the short snippets of observing Manfred pretending to be a server among the guests. Between that and the frequent option presented for Rook to be spooked by necromancy, Emmrich's questline features an extra layer of design variety that more closely approaches how the older games felt. Then Manfred sacrifices himself to stop Hezenkos' giant skeleton mech in the second instance of a companion arc featuring a loved one's self-sacrifice. This works for me more than Syrian because Manfred is a cute skeleton. The big ending choice of Emmrich's questline is whether or not he should give up his lifelong dream of becoming a lich to resurrect Manfred. This presents a counterintuitive but fascinating iteration on the theme of accepting change. Emmrich's fear of death has driven him to seek lichdom, to seek transformation into an immortal skeleton mage so he doesn't have to worry about dying ever again. Attempting to cheat death can easily be seen as a way of refusing to accept change, and one would think that this means Emmrich becoming a lich is a negative ending, where he falls into the mindsets of the villains of the game who try to freeze or reverse the passage of time. When he is presented with the option to revive Manfred at the cost of ever becoming a lich, one would think that reviving Manfred is the moral choice. But no. Whether he becomes a lich or saves Manfred, either way is presented as a valid resolution to his arc. This works because of why reviving Manfred denies Emmrich his lichdom. In the Necropolis, there is a morality test to become a lich that requires accepting that people around you will die. In other words, if you cannot accept the inevitability of change around you, then you cannot be trusted with immortality, as otherwise you could become an immoral immortal like the Evanurus or Solas. On the other hand, reviving Manfred means Emmrich is not accepting the change of living without him, but it does mean Emmrich will be forced to reckon with his own death. And the joy of Manfred's revival is in seeing him continue to grow, like learning how to speak. The paradoxes of both routes, where Emmrich is accepting change by refusing to accept change, are a lot more striking than what you might expect from a setup of, this guy wants to become a lich, do you let him or not? And it deepens the meaning of accepting change, makes the question more complex. It's what an RPG companion arc should do if it is meant to tie into the main theme. Elaborate and complicate the ideas in a way the main story does not have room for. Hezenkos is not quite a foil to Emmrich on this level, which lessens her effectiveness as his personal villain. The main point of difference is that she views spirits as tools, abusing them for the sake of gaining power, and he, of course, respects and nurtures them. This is also the reason why she's said to have failed the Lich morality test, rather than a refusal to accept the death of others. If only Emmrich's friendship with Hezenkos was clearer. Like with Lucanis and Ilario, these two characters were meant to be close once upon a time, and we never get a sense of it except our companion telling us this was the case. And Hezenkos' overall simplicity deflates what is otherwise a great companion arc. Davrin, the Dalish Grey Warden forced into the role of trainer and nurturer for the Griffin Asan, is a pretty good companion. As I said before, his arc is well established, when full care for the Griffins falls into his unprepared hands thanks to the Gloomhowler killing the two wardens who had been raising them. As a result, Davrin has a journey not too dissimilar to that of Joel from The Last of Us, at least in the broad sense of a stern man who feels unfit to be a caregiver, learning to open up and care for someone circumstance forces into his arms. But he's considerably more noble than Joel is, in line with the morally good baseline of the entire Veilguard party. Davrin, like Blackwall and Ser Jorri before him, decided to join the Wardens out of his own volition, out of admiration for their heroic ideal, and has been with the Order long enough to see the messy reality but still believes in the cause. I like the contrast between his serious, even weary demeanor and his maintained faith in the Warden's mission. It's a small bit of contrast, but helps add to his complexity. His woodworking hobby is conveyed largely visually, with him working on small pieces in group conversations to keep his hands busy, which is a good way of driving it home as his major hobby without him bringing it up in conversation all the time, like Lucanis and his coffee. Davrin's specialty as not just a warden but also a monster hunter, with a desire to make a better monster manual for other adventurers, is another small thing that fleshes him out. Davrin has a lot of personal interests that fit together well to create a character who, perhaps more than any other BioWare companion, just feels like a real dude you can hang out with. That's not to say he's the best companion ever, as many who don't feel as real in a down-to-earth way are just more interesting narratively. I also feel many of the lighthouse scenes with him struggling to figure out how to train Asan feel a bit samey, with him sternly asking Asan to do something, Asan being really cute and not cooperating, Rook giving advice on how Davrin might train him better, and then Rook leaving. The couple of scenes when Davrin takes Asan to Arlathan Forest are a lot better because there's more variety between them. The one where Davrin meets his old Dalish mentor and discovers Asan's protector side with the Hala is especially good, playing off Davrin's old dissatisfaction with his life among the Dalish, leading to him seeking purpose and adventure in the Wardens, him reflecting on how he has changed since then, and wondering if this means Griffins can change, or if at least his image of them should, when he discovers a compassionate side to Asan he didn't know was there. Davrin is the only companion who deals with both of the game's main themes at once. His time learning to train Asan deals with the theme of accepting change, of accepting his new role as a trainer rather than just a bodyguard, and also, to varying extents depending on the ending choice, accepting a change in the role of Griffins in the world. Meanwhile, the hunt for the Gloomhowler to save the rest of the Griffins deals directly with the choice and consequence theme when we learn the backstory of Davrin's nemesis. None of the other companions deal with the choice and consequence theme in a clear or significant way, which helps Davrin's arc stand out more. What also helps is that the Gloomhowler is the second best villain in the whole game after Solas, and the only good companion nemesis. The Gloomhowler's backstory as a former Grey Warden commanded to sacrifice the Order's old Griffins to stop the Fourth Blight is an incredibly dark choice I could imagine Duncan ordering. Davrin is disgusted by this, rightfully so, and the revelation raises a question that will be resolved near the end of the game. If the heroes have to do whatever it takes to win, would that not include morally reprehensible actions such as this? What are the limits to whatever it takes? The choice of how to deal with the First Warden at Weisshaupt actually pays off in Davrin's side quest. At first, talking down the First Warden prompts a telltale notification saying he'll be an unlikely ally, and punching him makes it say he'll be a lifelong enemy, only for him to get ambushed by Gillinan and seemingly killed very shortly after. This makes it seem like the possible ramifications were actually cut off. But in fact, the Gloomhowler finds and saves the First Warden and preserves him in Blight for Brooke. But in fact, the Gloomhowler finds and saves the First Warden and preserves him in Blight for Rook to find during the finale to Davrin's quest. If he was talked down, he remains lucid enough to give Rook the means to talk the Gloomhowler down in turn, but if not, he is raving mad and cannot give any advice. It's a really good way of paying off an earlier choice in an unexpected way, and conveys a subtle violence leads to more violence idea. I think there was more potential for Davrin to have drama and internal struggle over the Gloomhowler's past than we got, but there is enough there, and what we get is a highlight of Veilguard. As I said when we recruited them, Taash is an immature, blunt dunce who cares a lot about dragons but is often combative with the other companions about their own things, especially Emmrich. This abrasive unlikability is a big part of why they're the best written companion in the game. Other companions may be more pleasant to be around, but Taash brings life to the party and the game in a way none of the others manage. They're the youngest of the party, and the only one, I think, who was still a child during Inquisition, and they have not had the most affirming childhood. They were raised by a mother who, by her own admission, was never fit to be a mother because that was not meant to be her role under the Qun. So Taash has a lot to figure out about themselves, and isn't all that good at introspection. They're more clearly and consistently flawed than the rest of the party, and as a result, they have a clearer character arc as they come to terms with who they are and who they want to be. Taash's questline isn't as good as Davrin's because the Dragon King is a pretty lame villain, but their relationship with their mother Chthon elevates their arc a lot. The moment Taash is recruited into the Veilguard, with Chthon volunteering them without telling them first and expecting them to join, and also scolding them for using their fire breath, is a great scene establishing the lifelong tension between mother and child, with lines that convey so much of their fraught dynamic without too many words. The few scenes we get between them manage to make both understandable and sympathetic, especially if you have a familiarity with the strictness of Qunari culture that Veilguard unfortunately does not do a good enough job bringing new players up to speed on. The Qun is all about rigid role adherence, insisting that an assigned purpose leads to greater social cohesion and individual happiness. Chthon left Qunari society, but has not fully left the Qun ideology behind. She did not leave out of disillusionment with the ideas, but with the society built around them. In a Codex entry excerpting a guide for those leaving the Qun, written by Seeker Rowan, a member of the Lords of Fortune, Chthon has left her own annotations, one of them being, "It is reassuring to see that the Qun is not the only way of life broken by institutional corruption. She still believes in the culture, just not the politics." So, Chthon has raised Taash to honor Qunari traditions, even while living in Ravane. Chthon cannot fully accept the change of living outside the Qun. On the one hand, she shouldn't have to abandon the traditions she finds meaning in, but unfortunately, the rigidity of the Qun's role adherence makes living between two worlds extremely painful. And Taash is not only split between Qunari and Ravani cultures, they are also non-binary. The perfect setup for juicy character drama, and in this particular relationship, the game delivers. I really like the conversation Rook has with Chthon right before Taash comes out as non-binary to her, where Chthon says she is aware of her failings as a mother. It sets up the coming out moment itself as a mutually sympathetic scene. I know the obvious reading for a scene like this is that the non-binary person, Taash, is bravely coming out and entirely in the right, and the unaccepting parent is a bigot for not being immediately supportive. If that is the intention of the scene, then it is a failure, because Chthon reacts more with confusion to a new idea than intolerance, and Taash has zero patience for follow-up questions, treating Chthon's attempts to reach out and better understand her child as just criticism. But I am not even remotely tempted to read the scene that way. It doesn't play like Taash is supposed to be in the right and Chthon is wrong. It plays like two flawed people with a tumultuous history whose attempts to connect with each other in this moment fail because of their past baggage. Until now, every time Chthon has appeared, she has criticized Taash for failing to live up to her expectations of them in some way, for not properly following Qunari culture, even if Taash makes an effort. So when Chthon attempts to relate the concept of being non-binary to being a Qun Athlock, the Qunlat word for someone who has transitioned from one gender to another, I understand why Taash takes it as another moment of her forcing them into an unwanted role, even though it's clear that this time that was not the case. Let's not forget that Qun Athlock is not a good alternative for non-binary, because Qun Athlock specifically refers to transition from male to female or vice versa, and does not include anyone outside of that dichotomy, like Taash. So this scene reads so clearly to me as a moment where Chthon is actually seeing her child, maybe for the first time, asserting what they want and who they are instead of what Chthon wants and assumes. And Chthon wants to understand, but her own past harshness as a mother has poisoned the well, so to speak, and primed Taash to think of even the most reasonable follow-up questions as rejection.
I talked to you about not using your fire in front of the Antam. Remember to keep your consonants crisp. Qunari do not slouch, and neither does our language. This is not Iskap.
It was gonna take too long. Haram Marad Zasham.
More emphasis. The sentence is a march, not a race. Under the Qun, the term for one whose gender does not match the one given to them at birth was a Qunathlok. Perhaps you are like that.
Why do you have to keep picking at it?
When Chthon gets up to leave, she doesn't seem like she's unaccepting, more that she's recognizing how her past scolding has contributed to this and doesn't know what else to do. It's a coming out scene where the coming out actually feels kind of incidental. Again, if the intention was that Taash is all in the right and Chthon is all in the wrong, then the scene is a failure. But aside from Rook's responses not giving you the option to really push back on how Taash handles things, there's nothing in it that makes such a reading feel at all intuitive. And if you want a game that is much, much better about depicting a complex multicultural mother-child dynamic, then you should play 1000 times The struggle of living between two cultures and living outside the gender binary serve as sort of reciprocal metaphors for each other, and the culture clash is much more central to Taash's arc than their gender journey, though I do think the latter is well rooted in Taash's character, especially in one of Taash's Codex journal entries where they express frustration with the ambiguity in gender. They struggle with the lack of a right answer like their Qun-infused upbringing always taught them to look for. These entries convey their difficulty coming to terms with a lot of these heady concepts, finding a lot of them silly, and actually learning, which most of their dialogue scenes don't feature. The Qunari are a really good avenue to explore ideas about gender in a fantasy scenario. The Qun's role adherence leads to interesting things like how Sten in Origins can question a female warden by saying she must be a man because she is a warrior, because only men are warriors. Gender norms for Qunari are incredibly strict, but also untethered from biological sex. They have concepts like Akun Athlok, which accepts the existence of trans men and trans women, but does not include non-binary people, an identity in defiance of norm adherence. So a non-binary Qunari character like Taash, a direct challenge to the Qun's rigidity by their very existence, is a natural evolution of how the series has always probed this fictional culture. Now, I am not trans or non-binary. I am a brave little cis boy! So I am not any sort of authority on whether or not this is good representation. Trick Weeks, who wrote Taash, is non-binary. On their personal website's About Me page, they write, "My favorite part of being non-binary is arguing with different formal style guys about whether it has a hyphen, and this exact hyphen question is something Taash is annoyed by in one of their Codex entries." So, I don't know, seems like there's authenticity there. Maybe Taash is bad representation. Maybe Taash really is the Emilia Perez of video games.
Male dragons don't have wings.
Elgar'nan used magic to make the archdemons bigger. Maybe he added wings, too.
Ugh. And he screwed with her horns.
But to me, setting aside the good or bad representation question, they are at least an interesting character. They have their culture clash, their hyperfixation with dragons, their straightforward to a fault demeanor, a gradual acceptance of Emmrich, and a romance with Harding. Maybe I'm grading on a bit of a curve, but they're the most complex companion in the game, and their initially abrasive interactions with most of the party are fun. And their story's version of a loved one does a self-sacrifice to help against the villain is my favorite of the three because Chthon is a more interesting character than Manfred or Syrian, and also because Chthon just dies, and Taash never gets to say goodbye. Taash coming out, that moment of near understanding sabotaged by past baggage, is now their last conversation.
There was stuff he wanted to tell her, but he waited too long, and then she was dead. He never got to make it right. That twists you up.
A point of criticism I do have is that it feels strange for Taash to be non-binary, but then the main choice the player makes in their arc is to push Taash to embrace one of their two cultures over the other. Why is their gender non-binary, but their culture can't be? To be fair, it's not like Taash renounces the culture you don't encourage them to pursue, and you can change which one you encourage to give them a bit of a mix, but it still feels strange. Every other companion has one of two resolutions to their arc, and so I guess Taash needed a choice of two as well. Also, while Qunari culture is well defined, Rivaini culture is not, and is presented as little more than not Qunari, a stand-in for the rest of Thedas. The one thing I know that is specific to Rivaini culture is that the country has seers, mages who willingly let spirits temporarily possess them. That's neat. It's almost nothing. So Taash exploring being Rivaini doesn't mean we as players get to see what it means to be Rivaini, and that's also a shame. Johanna Hezenkos is a really fun villain, a gleeful throwback to classic horror as this half-lich plans to mass sacrifice people to power a gigantic skeleton mech in her haunted mansion. she's gloriously campy. But by the time we actually encounter her, we've been met with cartoon villain after cartoon villain, and what could have been a Tamatoa-esque breath of fresh, gleefully villainous air is instead just another power-hungry, egotistical maniac to add to the list. Across the whole series, the Arishok and Anders from 2 and Solas from this game in Inquisition are the only antagonists I would call great. And Anders may not even count because regardless of how you feel about his destruction of the Chantry, he never directly opposes Hawk, instead immediately surrendering once he enacts his secret plan. Loghain, in my opinion, is good but only becomes a great character once his time as an antagonist is over, in an outcome most players will not directly see. But most of the other villains function as they need to within their various arcs, and more importantly, prior games featured a nice variety in the types of villainy on offer. Origins features Loghain, who has some degree of noble intentions, and also Arl Howe, an unrepentant monster, and also the tragic villainy of Keeper Zathrian and his enemies the werewolves from the Dalish arc, and the desperation of Jowan from the Redcliffe arc. There's a mix of sympathetic and heinous, monsters and also villains with understandable motivations, or simply people pushed to extremes. This carries through into Dragon Age 2, with all the major villains being more sympathetic to some degree, or at least understandable and human in their evil like Meredith. Inquisition features Corypheus as a fairly generic evil overlord, and the cartoonish Magister Aramond, but also has characters like Alexius or Samson, Seeker Lucius, Lady Calpurnia, and a few others. This variety keeps things fresh, provides groundedness to the world, and often enriches the thematic components to the conflicts they partake in. Most RPGs aspire to mature storytelling, and as juvenile and edgy as some of Dragon Age's attempts at maturity could be even from the start, this variety in antagonism is a more successful way of conveying maturity. Sometimes real evil actually is shockingly cartoony, but often it's flawed people trying to do what they think is the right thing, or people who are twisted up by pain into lashing out, and this variety is mostly lacking in Veilguard's Rogues Gallery. The game presents a fairly black and white morality, with heroes who may make mistakes here and there but are uncomplicatedly good, and villains who are simplistically evil. Solas is an exception, as I've discussed, so let's set him aside. The two Evanuris are egotistical evil tyrants, and Gillinan also likes creating monsters and feels protective over what she makes. I do appreciate two other traits from each of them. Elgar'nan actually cares about Gillinan and is grief-stricken by her death, and Gillinan can be interpreted in interesting ways if you dig into the Codex. She was once an ordinary elf, or at least ordinary by the standards of the pre-Veil elves who were far beyond modern elves, and she was elevated into the Evanuris. Unlike her peers, she is not a spirit made flesh, but a born flesh being made divine. Her resulting obsession with the stuff of creation could be seen as a way to consistently prove herself as worthy of her new station, an expression of imposter syndrome and constant assertion of the trait that earned her ascension. It could be an effort to better understand life on a level those who were originally spirits never could, and perhaps surpass them. Either way, this likely also motivated her physical transformation, from the normal elven form we see in Solas's memories into the tentacled nightmare she is in the present, though it's equally likely, if not more so, that she was mutated in the Black City and didn't choose it. All of this is unfortunately limited to interpretation based on the Codex, and I wish we could have dug into her character more, but instead she and Elgar'nan are merely functional as powerful threats. The potential contrast that the personal villains of each companion could provide these gods is unfortunately squandered by the samey, megalomaniacal villainy nearly every one of them has, even when there was potential for more. In each of them there is an obvious sign of something deeper, conveyed either through visuals or greater context, that is nevertheless not explored through actual interaction. Ilario could have been so much more than he was if his feelings of inadequacy and jealousy towards Lucanis were brought more to the surface. Hezenkos's camp appeal is lost in her similarity with her peers, and the fact that she used to be friends with Emmrich doesn't feel present at all from her side of things. Ilario's accomplice, Magister Zara Renata, clearly has a vanity thing going on because of her use of blood magic skincare baths, but this is limited to her character and environment design. Aelia is a Tevinter supremacist who represents everything the Shadow Dragons have been fighting against, but again, in concert with all the other villains, she just feels like another one. The Dragon King is a dark foil to Taash as an Adari fire breather who is obsessed with dragons and lives free of the Qun, who represents what Taash could be if they lacked their heart and never questioned anything about their identity, but again, on screen, he is another ranting power-mad villain. His speech about feeling the Qunari held the Antam back from their glorious heritage at least puts him in line with Aelia, as an evil reactionary trying to rebuild a past glory, but otherwise he's nothing. Anaris also feels entitled to power, but the best characterization he gets is from the Archive Spirit acting in his name, and frankly he seems indistinguishable from Elgar'nan except his cooler headpiece. Antlers are cool. The exceptions are the Titan's Shade and the Gloom Howler. The Shade is not much of a character at all, just a representation of Harding's anger that, as I said before, was not enough of a building presence to really work here, so that leaves the Gloom Howler as the one good companion villain. She's a former Grey Warden, an elf named Isaiah, forced by her commander to sacrifice the griffins she loved to stop the Fourth Blight. This broke her, and when she left for her calling, her guilt kept her alive, but it twisted her into a powerful darkspawn similar to the Architect and Corypheus. She wants to kidnap the remaining griffins she once saved now that the Wardens have found and hatched them, while constructing a replica of Weisshaupt in the Deep Roads for herself and other Wardens who have succumbed to the calling. She is a tragic villain, someone warped by the pain of the consequences of her superior's choice, unable to move on. Her reconstruction of Weisshaupt implies a desire to return to being a warden, but she hates the Wardens for making her destroy the Griffins. She's torn, but she wants to feel like a hero again. She's also a good villain because she gets enough screen time to develop. Not only does she appear enough for her animosity with Davrin and Rook to feel personal, but her every appearance is an evolution of the player's perception of her, rather than just hitting the exact same beat each time like Aelia and Anaris do. If only there were more antagonists like her in Veilguard. The Butcher of Treviso gets close with a genuinely fascinating perspective as an Antam conqueror who has fallen in love with the city he's taken over. He sees its old leadership as unworthy of it, and wants to preserve what he loves about it rather than destroy it and override it with the Qun like the old Arishok in Dragon Age 2 attempted. Unfortunately, the Butcher only gets one scene. He does appear on a balcony giving a speech to his soldiers in an early mission Viago and Tea give you, but this doesn't give much characterization. His one meeting with Rook is enthralling, but then he lets himself succumb to the Blight and you kill him, so that Governor Evenchi can reveal themselves as the one who sold out Treviso and the real villain of the city's story arc. Evenchi is a little bit better than some of the other villains because their grievances against the Crows are valid if you're familiar with how Zevran described the assassins. But Evenchi would be an even better villain if the Crows were still in the process of figuring out if they should soften or remain brutal, like I suggested earlier. As it is, Evenchi is another really obvious traitor as the only character in Treviso who is constantly arguing with the Crows. I think Treviso being blighted makes their choice to reveal themselves to Rook and then make a play with the stolen comic poison feel like a much more satisfying story outcome, since it lends these scenes a sense of desperation with the city on the brink. If Treviso is saved, then the same events happen, but Evenchi just seems kind of dumb for doing it. So, there you have it. Veilguard's villains are generally pretty lame, and that's a shame. Veilguard's Codex is really good, but it's also kind of mandatory to understand the state of the world and a number of characters, which is bad. A good use of a codex enriches a player's understanding of the game's events, but there's enough depth and clarity within the actual scenes to make the codex optional. While previous games' codices were largely historical, Veilguard's features very present correspondences or personal writings from the characters we get to meet. Veilguard's conflicts are understandable if you ignore the codex, but doing so intensifies their shallowness. The most egregious of this is the schism between the Antam and the Qun. After the failed Dragon's Breath attack and Trespasser and subsequent public disavowal of the whole affair from Qunari leadership, the Antam began to splinter away until the entire military branch of the Qunari seceded to attack the rest of Thedas. What does it mean for these soldiers, raised to be only soldiers, to suddenly be trying to function on their own? It didn't go well for the Arishok in Dragon Age 2. What does it mean for the rest of the Qunari to see this complete failure clear in the unity of their culture that many we've met in the series have pointed to as proof of the Qun's superiority. If you ignore the Codex, you just hear that the Antam broke from the Qun, and then they function as foot soldiers for the Evanurus and obstacles to the Crows and Lords of Fortune. There's no real engagement with these ideas. This is such a shame because it is a truly fascinating development of what has always been one of the most interesting parts of Thedas' lore, and it fits perfectly with the rest of the game's themes of how people accept or resist huge changes to the world around them. There are, thankfully, a number of Codex entries dedicated to this topic. Not nearly enough to fully explore it, but at least there's much needed context about this secession, and a couple voices of Qunari and Antam reacting to this split. There's even correspondence between the Dragon King and the Butcher that hints at clashes between Antam's splinter factions. And on Tearstone Island, there's a note you can find. Not even a Codex entry, but a note written by an Antam who has suffered a complete crisis of faith after rejecting the Qun but finding the Evanurus equally unworthy of loyalty. The efforts of the Shadow Dragons to fight for equality and the abolition of slavery in Tevinter is another area that feels like it needs the Codex, and also choosing to save Minrathous, to fully appreciate. Slavery is a constant topic of discussion with characters from the Shadow Dragons, especially if you are one, but is rarely depicted aside from one slave in Emmrich's recruitment and a Minrathous side quest where you free some people who have been abducted. Furthermore, because the only part of Minrathous we get to really explore is Docktown, where the average person is certainly too poor to afford slaves, that means we rarely get to see the practice in practice. Codex entries are still another example of telling, but they flesh out this element and make it clear that the efforts of the Lucerni and the Shadow Dragons to end Tevinter slavery are still ongoing and facing intense pushback from the conservative magisters. I especially like this transcript of a speech given by Dorian to the Magisterium sometime between Trespasser and Veilguard. The Codex also features examples of elven characters discussing their gods, and extra characterization for Elgar'nan and Gillenane, including a seemingly remorseful remark from Gillenane that she's gone so far with her morbid experiments that she doesn't think she is capable of creating a creature as good and helpful as the Hala anymore. There's a whole host of extra interactions between the companions as they annotate each other's research notes and swap theories about how the lighthouse works. It feels like stuff that other Dragon Age games had included in more visible dialogue exchanges that got cut out or couldn't be implemented in a timely or cost-effective manner considering the massive shifts in development. There's a lot of flavored dialogue to be heard from random NPCs around Minrathous and Treviso that gives further texture to their respective settings, and this technique was used in prior games as well, but this would also be accompanied by NPCs you could have conversations with or get quests from, so this incidental dialogue is also less noticeable. When Mass Effect 3 did this, it at least drew player attention to it by often prompting Shepard to interject to support one side of an argument, rude as it may be to eavesdrop and butt in on people's conversations. Considering the Codex and the side dialogue and the strong plot structure, I have the completely unsubstantiated speculative belief that the writing process went something like this. While Dragon Age 2 was rushed and the writing team decided to go wild and left a lot of things unpolished but interesting, Veilguard was rushed after its second development reboot, and the writing team decided or was instructed to craft and polish the outline of core scenes as much as possible, but then had little time for more interesting stuff to be added except in the context of Codex entries, the least expensive writing to add in later. That is to say, it feels like Veilguard's writers made sure to really iron out the details of the plots and character arcs so they were all functional and mostly without holes, but could not go back to spice up and flesh out. Despite the common refrain that all the creatives who made the good BioWare games left before Veilguard, the writing team is made up exclusively of people who have been with the studio since Inquisition at the latest. I'm going to name specifics based on the Dragon Age and Mass Effect wikis, which seem to be sourced from various social media and forum posts by the developers, but being fan wikis, they could be incorrect. That said, Veilguard's lead writer, Trick Weeks, who also wrote Taash, was responsible for turning Tali from her bland Mass Effect 1 incarnation into one of the all-time great companions in Mass Effect 2, in addition to writing Morden and others. For Dragon Age, Weeks wrote for Solas and Cole in Inquisition. Lucanis was co-written by Mary Kirby, who was responsible for writing Loghain in Origins, and Varric in every game in which he appears, including this one, in addition to many others. Harding, my least favorite companion, was written by Cheryl Chee, whose previous contributions for the series include Leliana in Origins and Inquisition, one of my favorites. I could go on. The writing team is made up of demonstrably talented people who have mostly been with Dragon Age since the beginning, and I highly doubt that David Gator was the only one keeping them all on track while he was there. These writers know Dragon Age, but it seems that between 2 development resets across 10 years, they were somehow limited, whether by development constraints or game direction or both or something else. So they made the skeleton as stable as they could, and used the Codex to enhance some things in a low-cost way, but could not or did not add as much meat as previous games have in their average play experiences. However the Veilguard design strategy differed from Dragon Age 2, it resulted in a cleaner but blander narrative. But unless one of them actually confirms all of what I just said, this is just a theory. A game theory! How did MatPat do that? Something I can say from personal experience, though, is that just because a person may be credited as lead writer on a game doesn't mean they are actually in charge of the creative vision or have full control over how all the writing turns out. All of that is to say that I can still see the quality writing from older Dragon Age games in Veilguard. The heart of the franchise is here, the interest in exploring rich characters and the conflicts and changes in Thedas. It's just that a whole lot of it is uncharacteristically buried in a codex that most players will not read, or in random NPC dialogue most players will run past, instead of featured front and center like it used to be. So anyway, all the companions have resolved their issues and become Heroes of the Veilguard, which is this game's version of Loyal in Mass Effect 2. I've also helped the Grey Wardens, Crows, Shadow Dragons, and Veil Jumpers enough to bring their faction strengths to strong, but ignored the Mournwatch and Lords of Fortune this time around. The Hair Metal Wizard did do all of their side quests, but they're not relevant to the main story, and the Anime Crow is an impatient boy. So he goes to meet Morrigan in Minrathous to discuss their plan to attack the gods at Tearstone Island. The eclipse is still a number of units of time away, but it turns out that the Dalish legends were true and Elgar'nan can move the sun and the moon to force an eclipse right now.
They say he can move the sun and the moon, which seems bad for a lot of reasons.
Oh, great. Well, powerful people claim a lot of tricks they can't pull. Here's hoping he's one of them.
When I first saw this, I was like, wait, could he have done this the whole time? Why wait until the player is ready? But actually, I think this is meant to be a desperation move on his part. After all, Rook has been helping the various factions opposed to the Evanurus build strength, and most of the companion quests also involve undermining the Venatori and Antom, the Evanurus' main followers. So perhaps Elgar'nan was initially going to wait for the eclipse to happen, but felt that forcing an eclipse now was a good way to counter Rook's obvious alliance buildup. In the metagame, the timing is dictated entirely by the player, but if we consider this in-universe, it could be another part of the engaging back and forth I described before. The Veilguard knows that they're going to have to travel to Tearstone Island without being able to fully gather their allies. It's desperate, but they promise to get the job done, no matter what.
The gods won't leave that island.
No matter what.
No matter what.
No matter what, no matter what, no matter what,
no matter what.
Upon reaching the island, Harding and Davrin both volunteered to lead part of the team away to cause a distraction that can split the Antom's focus and make it easier for everyone to reach the gods. Rook has to choose which of the two of them will, as the game says, risk their lives to lead this team. It's reminiscent of the Impossible mission from Mass Effect 2. The last time Rook had to make a choice like this, the person they chose ended up getting hurt. I'm sure this time it'll be fine. Davrin, you're my favorite or second favorite companion, depending on the day, and Harding is pretty firmly my least favorite, so I'm entrusting this task to you. Rook and 2 followers fight their way through Tearstone Island to stop the gods from finishing their own version of the Lyrium ritual dagger, because otherwise they will tear through the veil and unleash the full might of the blight that has otherwise been still contained in the Fade. I kind of forgot to mention that was their plan, but that's what they want to do. All through this climb, Elgar'nan and Gillenane mentally taunt Rook and issue orders to their followers and are otherwise still their stock evil overlord selves. So Gillenane was played by Michelle Gomez, who was Missy in Doctor Who, Madame Rouge in Doom Patrol, and plenty of others. She's awesome. She doesn't get to flex very much as Gillenane. A shame. As generic as the villains still are, this mission is another good set-piece moment, especially the way it ends. It feels appropriately apocalyptic, and Elgar'nan and Gillenane enact their simplistic evil overlord roles well enough. After a long and graphics card-frying journey across Tearstone Island, the full team regroups in front of some blood magic wards. Bellara and Neve both announce their ability to deal with the wards, but also warn that each of their methods is really dangerous. Well, Anime Crow is dating Bellara, so you can deal with the danger, Neve. And almost immediately after success, the ward diffuser that the player just chose is abducted through an Alluvian by Elgar'nan. The fact that the game has you choose 2 companions to do 2 separate jobs, and then they start getting hurt after you've already locked in both is a really good choice. Assuming that you care about the companions, it's a good way of instilling anxiety about what's going to happen to Harding or Davrin, because the other shoe hasn't dropped for them yet, but you just know that it's going to. Also, it's devious that Bellara and Neve develop such a sisterly bond by this point, only for one of them to be unavoidably abducted. The team presses on and Gillenane strikes, picking off the team one by one to trap in her blight tendrils. And so begins our not-quite boss fight against Gillenane. The player has to navigate around a horde of darkspawn, slowly destroying the blight boils, keeping their 2 selected companions, Lucanis, and the chosen other team leader, trapped. Considering that we actually fight Elgar'nan later, it's odd that Gillenane is treated like she's too powerful to confront directly here. I suppose Elgar'nan has possibly degraded for his fight, which I'll theorize about when we get there. Once everyone is freed, Lucanis gets in position for another strike at Gillenane, but she stops him. Again. And the other shoe drops. The other team leader, in this case Davrin, decides to make the ultimate sacrifice to distract her long enough for Lucanis to get free and finally strike true. Anime Crow picked Neve for the wards and she got abducted, and picked Davrin to lead the second team and he got killed. There is no way to avoid either outcome. You can only choose who is sacrificed. I wish this was Harding. Not because I like Davrin more, not just because I like Davrin more, but because in her version, she shoots Gillenane over and over with arrows, actually doing damage to the goddess. With Davrin, he just kind of swings his sword in front of him ineffectually. It's a lamer sacrifice for a much better companion. But regardless, I applaud Veilguard for its boldness here. It is impossible to make it through the game without at least one casualty in your team. BioWare hasn't done this since Mass Effect 1, and there, you know when you make the choice that you are choosing them to die. Here, a first-time player doesn't necessarily know that they're picking party members to be put in danger, so it's shocking in a completely different way. And since Veilguard essentially couples the Vermeer choice in one with the impossible mission from 2 in the finale, it ramps up the tension of the choices you make for who to send where later on. Really smart design decision here. One thing I'll give away now is that Neve or Bellara, whoever gets captured, is not dead, and if she's a hero of the Veilguard, she will be completely fine in the end. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I like both of them enough to want them to survive. On the other hand, it kind of neuters the impact of their initial loss and the subsequent mourning of them once Rook is in Solas' regrets prison. It would probably make for a better story if they die after you find them. Or perhaps being a hero of the Veilguard means they survive but stay blighted, so there are still dire consequences. But speaking of Solas' regrets prison, after Lucanis stabs Gillenane, she dies in Elgar'nan's arms. Elgar'nan leaves to go to Minrathous, and with the Fade beginning to bleed into the real world, Rook grabs the knife out of Gillenane's body, only to fall into Solas' prison. Surprise, the trickster god known for betraying people, who you can, at many points throughout the game, express the belief will betray you, to which everyone around will say, yeah, he's totally gonna betray you, is betraying you. The cinematic itself is really well done. All the cutscenes are, really. And this is where the fact that the creative director John Epler's prior experience for the franchise was as cutscene director for all the other games seems to have really come in handy. Solas has been molding Rook into someone who could take his place in the new prison he made for the Evanurus. Remember how before Weisshaupt he basically forced Rook into agreeing to try anything to get the Wardens to help? Solas takes the dagger back and leaves Rook to rot in a prison sealed by regret. So, we're in the endgame now. We've been in it since Elgar'nan caused the eclipse, and I think this whole section of the game is pretty great. It's rare for even good RPGs to have good final acts. Veilguard is not what I would consider a good RPG, but its final hours are awesome. That said, I have two complaints. This prison is meant to be even more effective at holding the Evanurus than the Black City, but it's sealed with the regrets of those held in it. That kind of requires whoever is inside to be the kind of person who would have regrets, no? And as they've been characterized thus far, I'm not sure if that description fits Elgar'nan and Gillenane. How would they be trapped here? Well, there is that Codex entry about Gillenane saying she doesn't have it in her to make creatures like the Hala anymore, but if this is the only indication that either of the gods has regrets to be trapped by, it doesn't seem like a very effective lock for this prison. This could have three possible and compatible answers. One is that the gods do feel remorse and are somewhat complex characters, and the game just doesn't depict them that way at all. The second is that Solas is so prideful that he assumes a prison that could hold a self-pitying narcissist like himself could hold anybody, because everyone has the same fatal flaw he does. This reading is supported by his surprise that Rook was able to escape, but it also makes him seem stupider than he was probably meant to. The third possible reason is that because Elgar'nan and Gillenane do genuinely care about each other, their regrets might be the deaths of the other Evanurus as they withered away in the Fade after their archdemons died. But as far as for what the prison means for the story, how it was supposed to hold the Evanurus is basically irrelevant. Its true narrative function is to drive home the game-long contrasts between Rook as a leader and hero, and Solas as a leader and hero. It makes very clear that Rook and Solas harbor guilt for making choices that cause pain and even lead some of their followers to their deaths, like we see in two separate Solas flashbacks. As is explicitly said, Solas treats people like pawns and manipulates even those who may be willing to help. But Rook, a better hero, treats them like people, listens to their followers' problems, and helps out. And Solas is unable to move beyond the unforeseen consequences of his actions, while Rook, in confronting those lost so far, is able to accept that they made their own choices, and Rook can move on. So here's where we get to my second problem. The choices Rook is faced with don't seem to be difficult ones compared to the choices that Solas, the Inquisitor, Hawke, the hero of Ferelden, and even the mayor of Demeda's Crossing had to make. The toughest choices in the game, I think, are which city to save from the dragon attack and which Shadow Dragon leader to endorse for Archon, but that one only happens if you saved Minrathous. Some of the companion choices can be thinkers, like encouraging Emmrich to let Manfred go or accept his mortality, or which culture Taash should lead into more, but I wouldn't call these tough choices in the same vein as how do I end this horribly destructive war between my people and the Titans scenario that Solas was faced with. And choosing which city to save is a tough choice because either way someone gets hurt, but the responsibility ultimately falls on Gillenane's excessive amount of shoulders. Everyone understands this, and Rook is rarely meant to feel like they are responsible for the state of the unsaved city. Rook does not need to grapple with the effects of a situation that they caused the same way Solas does, so the attempted contrast between them falters a little. The closest scenario to replicating something Solas may have had to deal with is the obstinance of the First Warden, the one potential ally Rook has to deal with who stubbornly refuses to help. Solas would have tricked him in some way, manipulated him into either helping or being taken out of the picture. Rook's only options are extremely direct, and there's no pushback to either choice from the rest of the Wardens. And the First Warden's objections are patently irrational. He's so obviously in the wrong that there's never a moment of doubt about whether it's right to try to win him over or circumvent him. This is the main resolution of the game's choice and consequence theme, a recognition that some choices will have tough consequences and you just have to accept them and move on instead of being stuck in the past. It's a good message, but Rook is such a naturally good person that they rarely put themselves in a position where a truly morally gray option is even presented to them. This isn't necessarily a bad way to contrast them with Solas from a more general writing perspective, but in a player choice-driven RPG with choice and consequence as a theme, it's more glaring. However, the emphasis on Rook's followers willingly throwing themselves into danger with full knowledge of what they're getting themselves into does resolve the earlier question I had of when does whatever it takes take things too far? That answer is, of course, all about informed consent. Rook faces visions of the companion killed by Gillenane and the one abducted by Elgar'nan, and is able to move on, before finally confronting a truth that Solas had hidden from them with blood magic. Varric has been dead ever since the thwarted ritual. The one who has been talking to Rook in the lighthouse was just a hallucination, repeating what Rook already knew or thought. So every Varric conversation after the intro is really another way for Rook to talk to themselves. Although it seems like Rook knows quite a lot about what the Lyrium dagger used to look like when it was the idol found in Dragon Age 2. I like to think that this final farewell scene is with the real Varric. Maybe when he got stabbed, he got awakened to stone magic, and while he died, it connected him to the Fade enough to be able to talk directly to Rook now to say goodbye. I don't know, just a nice thought. After Varric departs, Rook hears their companions on the other side of a portal. They reach in and pull Rook out. This is another moment that could raise some questions logistically. I think the most reasonable explanation is that Rook's journey of self-acceptance managed to weaken the walls of the prison, enough for the efforts Emmrich and the others were taking to find them to pay off. So even with this self-acceptance, Rook could not have gotten out without the help of the Veilguard's resident Fade expert. This may lend a little more validity to Solas' choice to trap the Evanuris this way. I don't think this is made clear until you talk to whoever you're romancing, but it's actually been weeks since Tearstone Island, and the party has been trying to get to Rook and regroup this whole time, while Elgar'nan has taken over Minrathous and Solas has been helping the Shadow Dragons attempt to resist him. This time skip makes it more reasonable for Emmrich to have been able to attempt to craft this new dagger that he couldn't figure out the divine enchantments for. But otherwise, it leaves a significant gap of time for interesting things to happen that is never touched on at all. A little weird, but I guess that's what fanfics can be for. Now it's time for Rook to consummate their love with their love interest. It's fine. I don't view the majority of BioWare romances as better than fine. I never did it with Garrus though, so maybe I've just been romancing the wrong characters. As a romance partner, I like Neve better than Bellara, but I'm not playing the game 5 more times just to see everyone's romance arcs. Making this video has already taken too long with 2. After checking in on the party and really checking in on the love interest, it's time to plan the final desperate mission to take out both Solas and Elgar'nan. This is where the status of the remaining companions and the ally factions comes into play. After so many games of reinvention without refinement, BioWare has finally done it. They've finally taken an old concept and given it a new spin. Here we are at the Mass Effect 2 Impossible mission, version 2.0. I think the Mass Effect Impossible mission was flawed for 2 main reasons. 1, the squad was too big and available roles too few to give all the characters in a character-based game payoff to their presence. 2, some of the opportunities for characters to die feel cheap and arbitrary, and that encourages metagaming instead of earnestly engaging with the game. Veilguard's iteration fixes both problems, though it's still imperfect. This version of the Impossible mission gives everybody a chance to shine. Even the companion who died to take out Gillenane got their time in that sacrifice. Meanwhile, the finale has a role for everybody except for the 2 you want to take with you, who obviously get focus as the ones you take with you. You're actually using everybody's skills, instead of just using a few people's specialties and then lumping the rest together to hold the line. Fantastic. It helps that Veilguard has 7 total companions and 2 of them have been taken out of commission already, while Mass Effect 2 featured 10 to 12 companions, depending on if you had the DLC, and half as many available roles for the spotlight. The metagaming issue is lessened by choices that make the Impossible mission easier to get everyone through alive and giving more interface hints. So it's kind of still metagaming, but the game is actively helping you do it this time. Still not ideal if the goal is a tense choice where it's difficult to determine determine who the right person for the job is. According to the wiki, there's a pretty impressive variety of ways things can go down depending on what you have and have not done. If you ignored Emmrich or Neve's companion quests, then Hezenkos or Aelia can show up here, and they are more likely to kill the companions sent after them than their generic replacements. There's always one companion who is incapable of doing a specific job even if they are at Hero of the Veilguard status, and a sufficiently strong ally faction can help a non-hero of the Veilguard survive. However, if every companion has finished their arc and the 4 main factions are strong, then there is almost no wrong choice. In 2 of the 3 roles, the wrong choice is Lucanis, but in the other, the role of assassinating the Venatori mage who may be Aelia, Lucanis can always do it, even if he's not a hero of the Veilguard. Faction strength works a bit weirdly because the Mournwatch and Grey Wardens team up, as do the Lords of Fortune and the Crows, and their ability to support the companions you assign to them depends on their combined strength being 3 stars. So, if you ignore the Mournwatch and only help the Grey Wardens up to a strength of 2 stars, it should still be perfectly fine. In this playthrough, making everyone a hero of the Veilguard and helping 4 of the 6 factions meant everybody made it through fine. I think the impossible mission in Veilguard is an improvement over the one in Mass Effect 2. It helps that it's really spread across this mission and the Tearstone Island mission, with doom and loss on Tearstone Island and more likely success here on Minrathous. There's still room to do better, and being a completionist means you're so over-prepared there's basically no tension, but I'm glad to see some iteration on the concept after 14 years. Rook makes it to Minrathous' Hightown with the help of all their allies. Finally, after spending the previous parts of the game limited to the city's lower districts, we're now able to see where the upper class live, albeit in ruins as the villains have attacked the city. The hero has to fight through enemy forces to reach a point in the city where the villain floats high above it all, still tethered to the ground by a fleshy organic spire beneath an apocalyptic blood-red sky. Huh. Weird. Anyway, once in Hightown, Rook reunites with the Shadow Dragons and with Solas. He's immediately apologetic and proposes an alliance again.
I know I screwed up. I don't know why.
Oh, great. Of course. Here it comes. You can't keep doing this. You can't keep doing shitty things and then feel bad about yourself like that makes it okay. You need to be better.
I know, and I'm sorry, okay?
I didn't choose the option this time, but the tearful choice where Rook expresses heartbreak at Solas' betrayal is really good. By this point, Rook has Solas' respect, though the Dreadwolf is not quite out of moves. He promises that he will not tear down the Veil after Rook kills Elgar'nan, because he knows that with all the Avenuris dead, the Veil will come down on its own. Rook doesn't find this out until after they save the previously abducted companion, in this case Neve, who has been infected with the Blight along with several other mages in order to power and control the huge Blight masses throughout Hightown. So yeah, Solas is still a stinker, and I still like all his scenes. His Dreadwolf form is awesome too.
Corsica? That wolf thing? Was not an expression!
I'm not doing a lot of analysis for this part because it's simply good, and I'm summarizing to get to the end. The whole team meets up along with the faction leaders and the Inquisitor, Morrigan, and Dorian. There's a section where you can visit those who have fallen during the mission, and I'm sure this would be a lot more meaningful if any companions died, but since none of them did in either of my playthroughs, it's just kinda like, okay, that's some real sad music, I guess. The team makes a final plan to deal with Solas. They will kill Elgar'nan and then bind Solas' life force to the Veil with the ritual dagger. The possibility is raised of using Emmrich's failed duplicate dagger to trick Solas, and the Inquisitor, who still loves him in this run, suggests talking him down, which may actually be possible for a Rook who has seen all his memories and acquired the second fragment of Mythal. The heroes set off, leaving one of their own behind to help hold the line while the rest ascend to the Archon's palace. When the team reaches Elgar'nan, he looks like he's been going through it. He's still heartbroken about Gillenaine's death and is oozing with blight sickness. As best I can tell, this is the justification for why he's weaker now, to the point he can be confronted in a boss fight, whereas before he just froze everybody in time. Controlling the Blight was more Gillenaine's specialty, so he's a bit out of his depth.
Without you, the Blight is a brute weapon. Only your hands mold it into life.
The other explanation is that he's just toying with Rook until Solas and Neve, or Bellara in another timeline, can kill his archdemon and the resulting backlash of life force weakens him enough to be taken down. Or maybe it's both. And now, the last of the Evanurus is dead, and the Veil is beginning to crumble. Solas is still alive. 2 gods down, 1 to go. There's no boss battle against Solas. He's quite injured after his fight with the final archdemon, and Rook is spent after killing the last Evanurus. So all that remains is a choice. Does Rook try to trick Solas with the replica dagger, try to overpower him by force? Or use what we've learned about Solas's past and relationship with Mythal to convince him to willingly bind himself to the Veil? The first 2 options play out fairly similarly, and are both satisfying scenes if you see Solas as primarily evil. If he is fought and overpowered, he is livid, losing all his humility and openly declaring himself a god, as similar to Elgar'nan at the end as he feared. But if he's tricked with the dagger, he ruefully admits that he's been bested in a contest of wits.
Bested fairly by wits alone. I taught you well.
Varric taught me well. And you killed him.
You think yourself capable of judging me? I have faced things you could not possibly comprehend. You are a mortal! A mortal! And I am... I am a fool who finally met his match.
I like how Solas almost seems to notice that something is wrong with the dagger, but ignores it, as if he can't fathom that Rook's team could have made a replica like this. Solas should have studied the tactics of Dr. Eggman.
You thought you could trick me with that fake emerald, didn't you?
So, how did you know it wasn't the real one?
Tails! Because you just told me, Fox Boy.
Taking Veilguard on its own, these are satisfying resolutions to Solas's villainy. Fitting comeuppance for an antagonist who consistently used Rook and their team. But I've played Inquisition. For me, there's only one true ending. Choosing to talk Solas down brings back Morrigan, the Inquisitor, and the 2 fragments of Mythal to fully pay off their presence in the game.
To stop now would dishonor those I have wronged to come this far.
Even if those you wronged asked you to stop?
And Solas's previous hang-ups on Mythal are laid bare as the 2 fragments join together to tell him he has nothing to make up to her, and that his efforts to do so have instead caused harm to others.
The things that I have done
are not for you alone to bear, my friend. The many wrongs we did together.
Every regret we saw in the Murals was for an action Solas took because of his devotion to Mythal, because he glorified her and did not see her own similarities to Elgar'nan that Morrigan and Rook can recognize. It now takes the 3 people that Solas holds in high esteem, his revered Mythal, his friend and possible lover the Inquisitor, and the worthy rival who had broken free of his perfect prison Rook, to finally wear down his excuses and, in Mythal's case, give him permission to let go. At first I wondered why Mythal could not have just said all this when Solas confronted Flemeth in the Inquisition post-credits scene and avoided the events of Veilguard altogether. I suspect it is because then, Mythal was only 1 fragment, changed by her experience since the imprisonment of the Evanurus into a being Solas did not see as the true Mythal. But now, with 2 fragments acting as 1, a Mythal who got to know the Veiled world through Flemeth, and the Mythal who more closely resembles the goddess as Solas knew her, Solas can more easily view her words as coming from the same entity he put on a pedestal so long ago. And, I'm sure, it is meaningful for Solas that 2 mortal heroes he directly deceived and wronged are offering him forgiveness and redemption. Dragon Age Inquisition came out 10 years before Veilguard, and its Trespasser DLC came out 9. Across both games we got to know a clever, troubled, snobbish, and sad god. We stopped a plot by a mad Tevinter Magister trying to conquer the world, only to discover this powerful overlord was a mere patsy for the unassuming elven apostate planning something worse. In a reductive sense, the overstuffed pseudo-MMO that was Inquisition was all just build-up for what Solas was planning. And then a decade passed, So much has happened in the real world, so much has happened in the gaming space, and BioWare, the king of RPGs, accelerated its fall from grace that began when Dragon Age 2 was met with backlash. It felt like this cliffhanger would never be resolved. But now, finally, it is. What Trespasser set up has been paid off, and in this moment, it is everything I could have possibly wanted after the game I played 9 years ago. Veilguard is a deceptively polished Frankenstein's monster of 3 completely different games, falling short in many of the areas Dragon Age fans value most, but it absolutely sticks the landing on Solas' story, especially if you talk him down. For all the quibbles and insufficiencies I've found across 2 playthroughs of this game, I am more than happy to accept it into the series as a satisfying final send-off to the franchise's best character. So go on into the Fade, Dreadwolf. Your back must be tired from carrying half the games in the series. The real Veilguard was the god friend who constantly betrayed us along the way. Once Solas has entered the Fade to hold up the veil, one way or another, we see that because Neve is a hero of the Veilguard, she managed to survive taking over the Blight Tentacles and is completely cured now. Hooray. The team descends from the Archon's palace, and we get an extremely broad version of those Where Are They Now slideshows that pop up in most RPGs. One last iteration of a long-standing feature that has been stripped down to its bare essentials and lacks the detail that made it interesting in the first place. We only get a vague summary of how each companion and major faction ended their arcs rather than any details about what's going to happen next. And then it's finally over. Maybe. If you find 3 specific collectibles throughout the game, you get a post-credit scene where some guy says vague ominous stuff about how his secret group is coming, and the visuals show the villains of all the other games with a mysterious figure seemingly manipulating all of the previous game's events. So, beginning with Halo 3, each of the Halo games have included optional terminals you can find that flesh out the larger world and story. Just bear with me for a moment. Halo 3's terminals told of the Forerunners' doomed war with the Flood through records of involved characters. Halo 3 ODST has snippets of an audio drama that's a better story than the one in the main game's cutscenes. The Halo 1 remaster terminals gave the perspective of 343 Guilty Spark before and during the events of that game. In Halo 4, that's where they put all the characterization of their main villain. Oops. Halo Reach was a bit of a weird case, though. Instead of full terminals, there are datapads hidden around the levels that feature correspondence from a secret organization of artificial intelligences that have been guiding humanity from the shadows the whole time, despite never having been hinted at in the games before this, or having any meaningful impact on what happens in them. Despite the apparently huge reveal that human civilization has had this AI Illuminati playing some role in steering the ship all along, it feels so inconsequential that I can barely muster up the mental energy necessary to ponder its implications. That's how I feel about this Veilguard post-credits scene. In general, I really dislike the kind of reveal it hints at, that prior conflicts initially presented as flawed people reacting to the chaotic cause and effect of other people making choices was actually all part of the plan of some guys all along. It cheapens the original conflicts and reduces their poignancy because it takes an otherwise realistic portrayal of how history often unfolds and simplifies it into an artificially convenient narrative. It also takes characters who seemed to have their own agency before and retroactively says, nuh-uh. The thing is, I don't see that in this Veilguard scene because it's so vague, so meaningless. This Dragon Age Organization 13 or whatever has no specifics of how they've been involved, which was likely on purpose as it allows the creative leads to test the waters with the idea. I believe they've already made statements clarifying that Logain's actions and origins really were his own, and he just got nudged further on the path he was already taking. And if that really is a backtrack on the writer's part from their original plan, we'd never know because, again, we aren't given any specifics here. This scene doesn't have any ramifications for the previous games beyond some guys were interested parties in what happened, and how directly involved they were has yet to be defined. It doesn't feel worth thinking about or having an opinion on because right now it's just nothing. A tease of what is just formless story possibility with a villainous everything according to plan monologue that could mean anything. We might see what it means someday, we might not. And unless we do, I don't care. Similarly, the extent of the devastation in southern Thedas sounds really bad, but because we only see it through the Inquisitor's letters, BioWare could hypothetically do anything with what's left. They can say that only cities and places got wrecked, but every character that players care about made it through fine and is rebuilding. They can say the entire half of the continent is a barren wasteland and everybody is dead. They can do anything. Nothing is defined. So, if there is another Dragon Age game, which seems unlikely, we'll just have to wait and see. Dragon Age Veilguard is another Dragon Age game. It's the worst Dragon Age game. It's a miracle that it's so good. I don't want to repeat too much of what I said at the end of my previous BioWare video that's half as long as this one while covering 6 times as many games, but I could just copy most of it and it would still make sense. BioWare is no longer the king of RPGs, and after games like Disco Elysium, Baldur's Gate 3, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, and many more, even their games at the height of their popularity have aged. Dragon Age is a series that has never had a consistent identity, but Veilguard is the logical conclusion of BioWare's long-standing design decisions to streamline RPG mechanics and pursue actionized cinematic storytelling. I made my peace with that long before Veilguard was even confirmed to be finally releasing. The choice to reveal every long-standing mystery in one game gives me the impression that BioWare made it knowing it could very well be the last one, like how Justice League Unlimited wrote each season finale to serve as a whole series finale until it was finally cancelled. Sure, there is the mysterious council of some guys, and constant references to a so-called devouring storm on another continent across the sea, but just about everything set up as a mystery from other games has been paid off now. Some consider Dragon Age to be dead because they hate Veilguard so much. I consider Dragon Age to be peacefully put to rest because I find Veilguard a satisfying enough resolution, and it feels like there's nothing left in the gas tank. At the end of my 2 playthroughs, Veilguard feels to me like one last ride to take care of unfinished business before finally collapsing of exhaustion. And since the game reportedly underperformed EA's expectations, that may be the end. Though, quick aside, the article revealing this underperformance also revealed that the EA soccer franchise formerly known as FIFA also underperformed, which is kind of insane, and that EA was more concerned about that. So either the loss of the FIFA name recognition really had an impact, or there may be a much bigger slowdown for major releases than just Veilguard. But as far as Dragon Age is concerned, yeah, Veilguard underperformed expectations after a protracted and turbulent development cycle reminiscent of Duke Nukem Forever. During the decade of waiting, when I heard the game was being scrapped and redesigned into a live service game, and then scrapped and redesigned as a more classic RPG, I knew that whatever Dragon Age 4 turned out to be would be bad. I suspect that, more than anything else, killed enthusiasm for the game before there was a single trailer and sabotaged its potential success. But I don't think Dragon Age 4 actually turned out bad. It turned out passable. It ended well. I'm happy to let Dragon Age rest. Now we have Larian, Owlcat, and many others who already picked up where BioWare left off and, in my opinion, left them in the dust a while ago. Veilguard is okay. And now it's over.
And we will always be grateful to those whose stories brought us where we are today. And those whose stories will live on with us forever.
Oh, wait, I forgot. There are pronouns in Character Creator, so it's ruining the West, actually, and also hates you, personally. Wyatt? I guess I could have just said that and saved myself, like, 2 months and gotten thrice as many views. Silly me. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell, or whatever it is that I'm supposed to ask you to do.